the one who participated in the conspiracy against the tyrant, the villain who destroyed the empire, the enemy who took away his family and beloved. Then, he asked Artesia to come up with a plan to save the empire. Artesia was badly beaten and lay on the red carpet. Emma screamed that she was a heartless and inhuman creature who had killed Abe. Artesia didn't understand at all what Abe had done to her. Emma screamed and asked how Artesia could do this to her own nephew. Emma believed that Artesia should suffer just as much as Abe. Lawrence told Emma to calm down, but she didn't understand how that was possible. After all, her child had died, and she didn't understand why Lawrence was so calm. Abe was Lawrence's son, and he should have sympathized. But Lawrence said Emma should understand that this was a misunderstanding, because Tia was like a sister to him. Emma promised that she would definitely take revenge and fell to the floor. First, they made Artesia out to be a criminal by framing her without a child, and then the accusations only grew. In fact, she was indeed guilty of many sins, and Lawrence knew about most of them, so there was no need to falsify the crimes. It was a conspiracy orchestrated by Emperor Lawrence himself. Lawrence approached Tia and said that he couldn't believe that she was capable of such a crime. He asked if she really killed Abe, and Artesia looked up. Emma screamed that after the maid's visit, Abe started bleeding black and died. Tia's maid was brought in, and the Emperor said that he wanted to ask her a question. He asked if it was true that she had given Abe poison on the orders of the Marchioness Roseanne. The girl confirmed this and said that first, the Marquise Roseanne killed Abe, and then she was going to kill the Emperor himself. Everyone was in complete shock, and Lawrence finally decided to ask if Tia had any words of defense. Artesia turned to His Highness and declared that the Emperor was the only legitimate ruler of this empire. Now everything is in his hands, and Lawrence must stop shifting responsibility onto others. This was her last advice to him. One of the knights grabbed Artesia, shouting that she was insolent and did not know her place. Lawrence ordered that she be taken away immediately and the traitor be locked up in prison. After this, Artesia was tortured and repeatedly forced to sign some papers. Then a trial was held over her, in which the Emperor himself and several aristocrats participated. Despite the relationship, her crime was too serious to be forgiven, especially considering that her actions almost led to the collapse of the empire. Lawrence ordered her tongue and hands to be cut off for the blood of innocents, so that she would become an example to others. They were told to make sure she stayed alive. When the sentence was carried out, Artesia was chained. As a child, her mother told her that Lawrence was a good man and that Artesia should be worthy of him. She understood this, and Artesia's mother was Melara, the wife of Marquis Rosanna, during the reign of Emperor Gregor. According to the laws of the empire, married men were forbidden from having relations with unmarried women, so those in power entered into marriages of convenience and kept their partners under control. Michael Rosanne gave Melara to the emperor in exchange for rich sapphire deposits. Soon, Melara gave birth to his son. It was Lawrence, but Artesia was not the emperor's daughter. The elder brother was the emperor's son, and his sister was a copy of Michael. His Majesty, showing mercy, allowed the girl to live. It was believed that Artesia should never have been born. That's why she constantly heard the same thing from her mother. She had to be kind to her brother, because it was only thanks to him that she was alive. If it weren't for Lawrence, they wouldn't have been able to survive as a Marquis family. She had to live for her brother. For their salvation, he had to become emperor. And when Lawrence ascends to the throne, he will certainly not treat his only sister badly. Now their entire family's happiness depended on Lawrence's success, and Artesia had to understand that. Artesia didn't remember her mother ever loving her. Now she didn't feel at all like a part of this family and their history. She was only praised when she did something useful for Lawrence. Only when Lawrence said that his sister had made delicious tea would his mother speak approvingly of her. The property of the Marquise Rosanne brought significant material benefits. Artesia was not stupid at all. She understood that her mother would never be kind to her. But it was too difficult to contain the desire to be loved, which had arisen in childhood. It was easy to find reasons to justify it. Lawrence, Mother, and Artesia were related by blood. If Lawrence fails, they will all die together. Never before had a family claiming the throne survived. Artesia was willing to do anything to survive. She had a talent for conspiracies and crimes. She betrayed loyal servants, leading them to death, and undermined the political position of the empire. Even more small but dark deeds were committed in the palace. Everything that caused pain to citizens and took many lives was Artesia's fault. She used Saint Lycia, the symbol of the people's hope, and ultimately destroyed her. It was all for Lawrence. If it was a fight for the throne, it was considered natural. Her brother said she'd done a good job. Even if it was just words of comfort, she did everything with indifference and composure. In the end, Lawrence achieved his goal and donned the imperial crown. Artesia had played a key role in his rise, but when it was all over, she had silently stepped aside, asking for nothing. It was all because she was afraid. She stood aside amidst the general noise without saying a word. Because of this, she destroyed all information about the organization that she had built over the years with great effort. At that time, it seemed to her that the affection between her brother and sister could save her life, but she knew too much. She had too many sins to her credit. So Lawrence had her tongue cut out so she could no longer speak. And he cut off her hands so that she would not be able to write anything down. The law was simple. When the hunt was over, the dog was no longer needed. Artesia was that dog for Lawrence, and prison became her cauldron. What goes around comes around. She laughed. Too loud, her laughter attracted the attention of the guards. Even without a tongue, one can laugh. She knew her sins too well, and Artesia did not want to be justified or forgiven only out of pity. But only once was Lycia truly a saint. Then Artesia threatened her and forced the saint to marry Lawrence. She did not ask, because she was sure that Lycia was offended by her, and the saint said that perhaps the girl would really feel better if she held a grudge. The saint asked in surprise what she should do now, since she had already forgiven Artesia. Suddenly, the answer escaped her pale lips. Sacred influence and symbolism were needed to fill Lawrence's emptiness, to give him what he so lacked. And for this, Artesia used it completely. Suddenly, the saint became ill. All the citizens of the empire were happy to hear that the saint would also become a princess. At Lawrence's coronation, flowers presented by the empress were laid out along the walls of the palace, like a mountain. The empire covered her body with gold and furs, and she spread silk before her feet. The woman born into a beggar's family on the northern outskirts became one who could now afford all the luxury in the world. But if you remember the time when she first came out to people without a single piece of jewelry, or the day she helped in a region ravaged by infection, dressed in simple peasant clothes, now her skin has turned yellow, and her beautiful golden hair with a red tint has lost its shine and become brittle and dry. The full red lips also faded, and it was Artesia who was the cause of all this. It was Artesia who sent her to this hell. She thought she could protect Lycia, and she felt sorry that she couldn't protect her. From this cold place and from Lawrence? This also concerned his complex about his own legitimacy. Legitimacy is the voluntary recognition by the people of the right of the government to make binding decisions. This union gave rise to a feeling of anger and inferiority in him towards Artesia, the empress beloved by the people. Lycia, imprisoned in a golden prison, almost withered away. The servants cried out that the empress had lost consciousness. Lycia's sacred power was so great that it could save a person from death, but it proved useless for her own illness. She told Artesia that she was okay. It was her own fault that she ended up here, not Artesia's. Whatever the reason and whatever Artesia's attitude, it was ultimately Lycia who agreed to marry Lawrence. The saint also noted that she knew how terrible things Artesia had to endure, and although this cannot serve as an excuse for her actions, the saint decided to forgive her before others. Therefore, Artesia may not include Lycia in the great burden she bears. If one day Artesia meets Mr. Cedric, she will have to tell him that Lycia lived without regrets. Artesia replied that she understood and would definitely pass this on. As she was dying, the saint asked the girl for forgiveness. Apparently, she was unable to save her. These were her last words. Artesia couldn't understand whether she had dreamed all this, or whether these were memories of Lycia. She had been in this dungeon for so long that she had already lost track of time. Suddenly, someone spoke to her, but she did not understand what they wanted from her. Looking closer, she saw that Venia was standing in front of her. Venia was Lycia's maid. She admitted that she had never imagined that the emperor's representative would end up with nothing. And then she added that perhaps the only reason she wasn't killing her now was because of Zhenya. Artesia did not understand why this servant was saving her and freeing her from her shackles. In her state, she could not think clearly. All she knew was that she was being taken away somewhere. She didn't understand where exactly and why. She was placed in a cart with linen and taken away from the imperial palace. The torture and the journey here had worn her body down. It had been too much. She was so exhausted that after taking just a couple of sips of the tea he had brewed for her, she fell asleep again. The man looked at her and realized that the Marquise Rosanna had woken up. Cedric stood before her, noticing that, despite being the greatest schemer in the Empire, she was unable to save herself. The girl didn't understand why she was now in Cedric's military camp. Artesia didn't understand why he kidnapped her. Or maybe he just brought her to this place. One day, she blew up a dam on the Ava River to slander Cedric. By order of Emperor Gregor, he had been assigned to deal with affairs on the Empire's western border, and at that very moment, he was on his way back. However, instead of returning to the capital, Cedric withdrew his army to deal with the damage caused by the flood. Because he disobeyed a direct order, the Emperor lost his trust in him. Ultimately, Cedric fell into disfavor and became a persecuted person. Cedric asked Artesia for help in stopping Lawrence's tyranny, claiming that he needed her. He begged the Marquise Rosanna to do something. She still had her sharp mind. She was alive, which meant she retained her will, and therefore the ability to achieve anything. After all, she herself had already felt the full brunt of Lawrence's cruelty. On the way here, Artesia remembered how she had already seen a similar picture in the cart. The once thriving city of Barga, home to the best wine in the Empire, has disappeared. According to Venia, it happened 12 years ago, when Lawrence exposed Archduke Roygar as a criminal who was allegedly preparing a secret crime. There were many other places in the same terrible state. Artesia reflected on the senseless massacre in the cart, just before she lost consciousness. The Archduke knelt before Artesia, his enemy, and said that she must find a way to overthrow Lawrence, no matter how powerful he was. His servants and he himself could only understand military affairs and could not imagine how to equalize forces. Artesia didn't know what to do, feeling the weight of moral duty. Never before had she heard such words from Lawrence, whom she had sworn to serve for the rest of her life. She wanted to live her life without regrets until the very end. It was her own decision when she first stained her hands with blood. He realized that perhaps even Artesia would not find a way to overthrow such a powerful man and stop what was happening. But, alas, emotions still overwhelmed her, and he said he would later appoint people to escort her to the village. It would be better that way. Let her spend the rest of her life in peace. The lady did not have a clear plan, but she had the means to implement it. It was ancient magic. Much time has passed since it disappeared from this world. Human sacrifices were one of the reasons for its disappearance, but the main reason was that too few people knew how to draw magic circles properly. However, Artesia was fluent in the ancient language. It wasn't dead. If she couldn't turn the tables, she could still take everything back, even if it was now in enemy hands. She bit the remaining part of her tongue several times and chewed the mucous membrane to collect the blood. There would be no second chance. Artesia had to control herself and focus. Suddenly, a glow appeared in her tent. The ideal victim turned out to be the Marquise Rosanna. At that moment, Cedric entered her tent and froze in complete shock. In her next life, Artesia wanted to fulfill his will. That's what she thought then. But why she returned remains unclear. Waking up, the girl went to the mirror and realized she really had returned. Perhaps she misunderstood magic. It was too late to turn back time in exchange for her own life, but she was still alive. Error in the circle or something else? This could have been the reason for her survival. She made her decision. In exchange for worshipping the demon, Cedric received power, and now he would dirty his hands for her. This happened on the 2nd day of June, 482 in the Empire. 8 days ago, Artesia turned 18 years old. There are still 2 years left until she can inherit the title of Marquise Rosanna. It was quite hot last night, and Mother asked Lawrence if he had slept well. He confirmed that he had. Lawrence also noticed that as night fell, it became less stuffy. His mother suggested that he should let her know in advance if he had no appetite, and then she would ask the chef to prepare his favorite cold, smoky soup. Artesia wants to get a good idea of how quickly things are progressing. The mother noticed that Lawrence had not yet sat down to eat, and Artesia was already getting up from the table. Artesia replied that she just wasn't very hungry. Her mother was about to scold her, reminding her that table etiquette should be observed. But Artesia said she just wanted to visit the temple on the outskirts of town and hoped Lawrence wouldn't mind. Lawrence said she could go, and then the mother smiled. Artesia was grateful to her brother for his permission. Lawrence's mother asked him in surprise why he had suddenly become so caring and how it seemed that he was now truly thinking about his younger sister. When Artesia left the room, she was met by a maid. She noticed that the lady had eaten poorly again and was surprised why she had left so early. She usually sits longer. It was Alice, the first servant Artesia personally chose. She proved so loyal that she was once poisoned in her mistress's stead. Artesia was very happy to see Alice and just smiled at her. The maid felt that something had happened and she needed to do something urgently. But Artesia turned away and said that nothing special had happened. Her character did not allow her to show how touched she was by the concern. She turned to Alice and said that she was going to the temple. Alice smiled and offered to help with the packing if the lady needed it. Then Artesia came closer and whispered something in the maid's ear. She told us to put more meat in our sandwiches for the road and not to take a tea set with us for the picnic. Artesia also asked to call Sophia so that she could help with clothes, and Alice did not strain herself. Sophia asked what kind of hairstyle the mistress would like. Artesia replied that she simply wanted a neat updo. When the hairstyle was ready, Artesia said that she wanted something beautiful. Sophia smiled and noted that their miss had really grown to such an age. But Artesia herself didn't understand what they were talking about and asked again. Then Sophia added that the lady simply wanted to be beautiful and have affairs with handsome men. The Marchioness told Sophia to stop talking nonsense, saying that she was simply going to the temple. Sophia thought that the lady was also expecting this, but she replied that she did not understand what kind of nonsense had come into her head. One of the maids noted that the girl should understand where she was getting into. If you think about the Marquise's age, she has now become a real pearl of great value in high circles. However, she didn't have time to finish, because Artesia's mother entered the room. The maid immediately bowed when she saw the Marquis's wife in front of her. The Marquise glanced around the room and looked intently at her daughter. She wondered if Artesia, with such a face, was really going to seduce someone. Artesia asked her mother what the consequences of such power concentrated in the hands of priests would be. The woman sat down in the chair next to her, and then Artesia asked if her brother was going anywhere today. She was sure of it, but her mother replied that it was none of her business and expressed the hope that Lawrence would not be carried away by some chatty schemer. Artesia assured her mother that there was no need to worry because Lawrence was a wise man. Then the Marquise smiled and said that it was true. Artesia's brother was not at all like most men. However, she admitted that she is worried that when men fall in love, they often forget about their mothers. But she doesn't want this, and she hopes that Artesia won't do this. The girl was silent for a while, trying to say something. In the end, Artesia promised that she would always be by her mother's side. The mother smiled and confirmed, of course, because she was her own daughter. A little later, the maid reported that the lady's premonition had been confirmed. Everything was ready. The Marquise smiled and wished them a successful trip. It was necessary to go to the temple. Leave a donation and freshen up a bit. After all, the temple servants also need to be taken care of. The hairstyle, of course, didn't turn out the best, but the girl just said that she understood everything. Sophia asked the lady if everything was okay with Liana. The Marquise replied that yesterday, as well as today, this was not the first time. The maid agreed, but still tried to help, and then the Marquise told her to simply help her with her clothes. Soon the lady already had a new hairstyle and was wearing a smart dress. The maid noted that today she was especially good and sweet. Her hair was slightly curled, but she straightened it immediately. It looked beautiful, although the words sounded a little out of place. This was not quite in her character, and at that moment Alice entered the room, stunned by the appearance of her mistress. Alice noticed that the lady looked delightful, and it would be wonderful if she always looked like that. The lady responded with restraint, that it was, of course, flattering, but such attempts would have no effect. She then asked if everything had been done as she had requested. The maid did not understand that it was Artesia who ordered the food to be wrapped for the journey, but, as she was told, everything had been put in the carriage. After this, Artesia got ready and headed for the exit. Now she was certain that the future would definitely change. The military camp was located outside the Krates Empire. Now is not the time to be stubborn. You just need to do what needs to be done, or at least make the situation better. In any case, Emperor Lawrence had no intention of separating the Archduke from the Western troops. Therefore, they should simply carry out a reformation in the Ephron order and not resort to introducing troops. Of course, the Western troops were stronger, but they had no honor, only silver and glory. Cedric turned to the frail and said that these soldiers had been suffering for over a year. He also noted that despite what was happening, they were still paid pennies. Wealth wasn't the most important thing. Even if conquest brought glory, without honor and pride, the Western troops could end in dissolution. And if this happens, the entire empire will be under threat. The young man did not know what to do, and then Cedric said that he was going to ask for reconciliation. The butler asked if it would really help. He thought it might be worth a try. Frankly, he'd had a disturbing dream and wanted to visit the temple at the first opportunity. The boy was surprised to hear that the butler had a dream. He asked again, but Cedric didn't answer, and I began to think that the dream might have been about a girl. She cried silently, and large tears ran down her cheeks. Seeing this, everything inside him seemed to shrink. One way or another, this dream left behind bitterness. Frile dismounted and asked what was the matter, and the man informed him that a wheel had fallen off their carriage. He asked if they could fix it, and the butler assured him it was no problem. Then, Artesia approached Cedric and thanked him, but he replied that it was not worth it. He was amazed. In front of him stood the very same girl from his dream. He was sure it was she, the one he had dreamed about. After some time, his servants finished repairing her carriage. The girl sincerely apologized for delaying them. However, Cedric's servant suddenly said that there was no need to apologize. Helping those in need was quite natural for them. However, she looked like a noble lady, and it was dangerous to travel without protection. She explained that it was just a short trip to the temple. They were on the road now, but when they reached the temple, she would definitely thank him. The young man objected that there was no need to do this at all. Artesia turned and looked at Cedric. He bowed to her, and she said goodbye to him. He opened the carriage door and wanted to help her up. He extended his hand to her and asked her to accept help. The girl was surprised and didn't know how to react to this. Artesia froze, not understanding why Cedric was doing this. After thinking for a bit, she nevertheless put her hand in his. After some time, looking out the window, she realized that they were almost there. She also noticed that Cedric was accompanying them. The maid also reported that they were almost there. They stopped at the temple, and Cedric went on about his business. At the temple, the young Marquise Rosanna was greeted with respect. Artesia was grateful that the butler came out to greet her. She also said that she had brought beeswax with herbs and wanted to offer it to the saint. He noted that the saint would be delighted with her hospitality from the bottom of her heart. After this, they entered the temple, and Artesia began to pray. Even though it was all for the sake of using magic, she asked for forgiveness for sacrificing herself. Despite her decision to serve these fools, Artesia believed Archduke Ephron was a worthy man and needed to be watched over. She asked that the one who was dangerous be protected, her fox daughter. The priest asked Artesia with interest if she would like to meet with the bishop to discuss issues or get advice about what was happening. Artesia replied that there was no need for that. She simply wanted to enjoy a cup of tea and take a little break from the stress of the day. The priest offered to prepare a gazebo for her so she could relax. Artesia thanked him and added that she had another equally important request. She explained that the knights who had accompanied them on their journey had provided assistance and she wished to repay them. Her request was that the priest escort her maid to them. Artesia insisted that her gratitude not go unnoticed, and the priest readily agreed to help. After some time, her maid was sent to the knights. Some time later, Artesia sat in a cozy gazebo, enjoying the peace and anticipating what the day would bring. Lost in thought, she felt a little relaxed. Suddenly, she turned to see Cedric approaching her. He approached with dignity as always, but his gaze was more serious than usual. Artesia realized they needed to reintroduce themselves, as her name now carried a different weight. She introduced herself as Artesia Rosanna, calmly and reservedly. Cedric, as Artesia had expected, knew she was the daughter of the Marchioness Rosanna. She confirmed this, feeling his gaze pierce her, as if he already knew everything about her origins. Cedric pointed out that if she knew who he was, the Archduke, and yet she made a big deal about the broken carriage, then she probably also realized that he had no sympathy for her. Artesia looked down, realizing her game had been exposed. He knew what she was thinking, and that left no room for further ambiguity. She felt an unpleasant realization wash over her. Cedric expressed bewilderment at how it could have happened that a wheel had simply fallen off the aristocrat's carriage. There was irony in his eyes, but also a certain amount of bewilderment. The knights were served meals as if everything had been planned in advance, each knowing what was due and when. Everything happened with remarkable precision, as if in a carefully orchestrated system. Artesia admitted openly that this was indeed the case. She had planned this moment in advance, simply to talk to him, to find a pretext for conversation, and to understand what was bothering him. She was the same girl who had recently appeared to him in a strange dream. But now, as she stood before him in reality, her eyes didn't seem so soft. They were cold, yet bright, like ice. Cedric, watching the proceedings, said he hoped her actions weren't a waste of his time. He didn't want to waste time on idle chatter, as matters were more important than the whims of young ladies. He sat down next to her but was in no hurry to start a conversation. Artesia, meanwhile, poured him a cup of tea, as if expecting it would help him relax a little and allow them both to focus on the conversation. Cedric was puzzled by the behavior of the Marchioness's daughter, Rosanna. He couldn't understand why she was behaving this way toward him, why she seemed so unafraid to make such frank requests, which were not usually discussed. At first, Cedric decided to simply sip his tea, observing her actions. He wasn't sure what to expect from the girl, but he decided it was best to wait and see how she developed the conversation. He was prepared for any turn of events. At some point, Artesia made a decision and approached Cedric with an unexpected request. She expressed a desire for him to propose, even if only formally, so she could solve her problem. Cedric choked on his tea at these words. He hadn't expected to hear such a request. It was so unexpected that he began coughing, trying to process what had been said and figure out how to respond. He noted with surprise that, to be honest, he would never have thought that the young aristocrat he had met just a few hours ago would suddenly put forward such serious and unusual proposals. Artesia reassured him, explaining that she wasn't asking for a real marriage. She simply wanted a formal union to help him with the problem that had been causing him so much trouble lately. Cedric asked again what exactly they were talking about and what exactly she meant. He clearly hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn, and he was curious about what she was trying to convey in this context. Artesia explained that His Majesty had been actively waging psychological warfare for 2 months now. She could notice changes in his behavior and felt the weight of this hidden pressure. The problem was that the soldiers weren't receiving their due pay, which could have had disastrous consequences. One wrong move could have destroyed both the Western and Southern military structures. She was sure the Archduke was troubled by this, since he had come here specifically to ask the Archbishop for reconciliation. There was a tension within him that was difficult for him to conceal. The gentleman agreed, confirming Artesia's words. He didn't object, though his gaze betrayed some doubt. Nevertheless, he acknowledged the validity of her observations. Artesia decided to voice her opinion, stating that this decision seemed extremely unwise. She believed that such steps could only worsen the situation and lead to unpredictable consequences. Even if the Archbishop decides to intervene in the conflict, His Majesty will still have to refuse the reward. This step, in her opinion, will not produce the expected results and will not help stabilize the situation. This will not enhance the Western military's merits in any way. On the contrary, awards are currently of no use. The time for such steps has passed, and other actions are more important now. Artesia believed it was necessary to choose someone capable of leading others and willing to take responsibility. Only such a leader could handle the situation. The rest would be outraged if they learned that His Majesty had replaced a true hero with someone completely different, especially at such a crucial moment as Victory Day. It would call into question their credibility. The commanders would likely have felt disillusioned and might have requested withdrawal from the Western forces. They were prepared to act, but only on the condition that their actions were backed by genuine leadership. Artesia added that His Majesty was very favorably disposed toward her brother Lawrence. This was obvious to everyone, but she saw a certain danger in this, as everyone could see his vulnerability. However, Lawrence lacked the support of the nobility, and when the struggle for the throne began, this would become his greatest weakness. Without strong allies, he would be vulnerable, and this could prove decisive in the future. Cedric didn't hide his displeasure with the situation. He admitted that it truly was a source of regret, but he couldn't do anything about it. He felt like his family bore a heavy responsibility. Cedric was confident he was ideally suited for this role. It would strengthen Lawrence's position and bolster the legitimacy of his claims. He would gain the right to the royal family name and retain power in the north, giving him a strong foothold in the west. He added that if his health were restored, it would create the desired impression of support for Lawrence. The emperor could then hand over the west to him, ensuring stability and strengthening their power. Cedric said Artesia understood his words and the meaning of the entire situation correctly. He noted that he was well aware of how important it was for Lawrence's future to take certain steps, and that they needed to be measured and careful. The man stood up and firmly declared that he had no intention of making any deals or begging for any concessions. He believed that the soldiers who had served him deserved their share of the reward and needed no further promises. He continued to insist that the soldiers had long since earned their privileges and rewards, and there was no need to make them dependent on political maneuvering. These rights were earned through blood and devotion, and they required no additional conditions. As he started to leave, Artesia stopped him abruptly, asking an unexpected question about the Archduke's conspirators' village. She inquired about his attitude toward these events and what response he intended to give. Cedric immediately flared up, deciding her words sounded like a threat. He looked at her with obvious irritation, perceiving her statement as a provocation. But Artesia remained calm, not intending to escalate into open conflict. Artesia calmly replied that her words weren't meant as a threat. She simply wanted to give Lawrence advice that could help him avoid any undesirable consequences in the future. Her intentions were pure and not intended to intimidate him. Cedric calmed down a bit after hearing her explanation. He realized Artesia wasn't trying to pressure him, but was merely offering an outside perspective. Lawrence watched silently, remaining lost in his own reverie and making no attempt to intervene. He remained in the room, and Artesia poured him another cup of tea, continuing to observe his mood. The awkward silence lasted for several moments, but both remained silent, aware of the gravity of the decision that lay ahead. Then Lawrence, after some thought, decided to ask Artesia what she really wanted. She calmly replied that His Highness should find a more advantageous solution that would bring greater benefit. However, Lawrence was certain that the real solution could not lie in dishonest cooperation for profit. He always adhered to the principles of honor, and the idea of compromise did not suit him. Artesia insisted that Lawrence would have to put his principles aside for the sake of his honor, as well as for the well-being of himself and the Western Army, which could be in danger in the near future. None of her family, neither her mother nor her brother, even suspected that she had met Lawrence. The entire encounter remained unknown to them, and she continued to operate in secret. The broken wheel on the cart was no accident, but a carefully planned move. It was intended to serve as the pretext for creating a false impression of what had happened. Everything was organized in such a way that outside observers who might be nearby would think that the situation looked different from what it actually was, and was in no way connected with secret plans. Artesia calmly added that it was entirely possible. A woman and a man could meet by chance and fall in love. It's a common occurrence, and that could have been the case in their case too. She suggested that Lawrence tell everyone that he was abandoning any further rivalry with the Emperor and had decided to return to the capital, ostensibly out of love for her. Such a move would seem plausible. After this, Artesia clarified that his next step would be to propose. This would be the logical conclusion of their story for anyone who might hear it. Artesia assured that if Lawrence agreed to her proposal and married her, the Emperor would not interfere with his future plans, and it would be a safe solution for all parties. Lawrence, hearing her words, turned away and began to ponder Artesia's proposal deeply, weighing all the consequences and possibilities that could arise from such a decision. His gaze fell on his teacup, and he asked if Artesia thought her plan would protect his ducal status. He doubted this move would actually bring him the protection he expected. Artesia approached him, wordlessly took the cup, and poured him more tea. She was calm, her gaze focused, and she said nothing, leaving Lawrence lost in thought. Lawrence, having received no response from her, nevertheless decided to clarify what benefit she expected to gain from marrying him. He wanted to understand the motives behind her proposal and what she could gain from the situation. Cedric noted that if Artesia wasn't trying to lure the alliance over to Lawrence's side through her political brother, then he was even more curious about the real reason. All she wants is to get all the property of the Marquis of Rozanne and remain independent, and in any case become the heir. Artesia noted that she was now 18 years old and would only be able to receive the inheritance when she was 20. Currently, Artesia's mother, who has full control over the Marquis's property, will retain this power for the next 2 years. During this period, she will be able to manage all family assets without restrictions. However, despite her power, she can marry without her guardian's prior consent, and once the wedding takes place, her status will be changed, recognizing her as an adult. This step will grant her freedom. Artesia confirmed these facts, but added that simply choosing a husband wouldn't be enough for her mother. The choice she makes must be carefully considered and coordinated. She emphasized that her mother would rather kill her fiancé than allow her marriage, so in her view, the Duke was the best candidate. His status and position made him a suitable choice. Lawrence, her brother, asked if she was planning to betray her family for her own ends. The question was important to him, and he was certain her actions could affect the fate of the entire family. Artesia calmly replied that she was merely a tool in this situation. She understood that her role was limited, and if someone else used her, it wouldn't be perceived as a betrayal by the people. She explained that if the instrument ends up in the wrong hands, its actions are not considered treason, because everyone understands that this process does not depend on the will of the instrument itself. Artesia said he, her brother, could protect her if he agreed to marry her officially, even if the union lasted only 2 years. That would be enough to protect her interests. If Lawrence can fulfill this role, she will be willing to support him in the future. He will be able to achieve a higher position if he fulfills her request, even if it seems difficult and requires sacrifice. If he accepted this offer, Artesia promised to help him become emperor. This was her condition, and she was confident his position would improve significantly thanks to this alliance. After these words, Lawrence became very angry. Unable to contain his emotions, hit her with his mug and asked her if she was offering him betrayal, taking into account her conditions and proposal to marry for political purposes. Artesia stated that the conversation was about the succession to the imperial throne and saw nothing surprising in this. For her, it was a perfectly natural question, given the current situation in the empire. She noted that the emperor had not yet chosen his heir, and that the duke, his highness, could also claim the throne since his rights to the throne were not disputed. According to her, if Lawrence truly wants the people of the Krates Empire to live in peace and harmony, he must take responsibility and take the throne. Otherwise, the future of the empire will remain uncertain. Lawrence was a ruthless man, and his ally Roigar was power-hungry. If they were to take the throne, the future of the Carthaginian Empire would be bleak and precarious, as their rule would only lead to destruction. The man couldn't take it anymore and stood up abruptly, declaring he couldn't continue this conversation any longer. His nerves were on edge and he was ready to leave without listening to any arguments. Artesia tried to stop him, but he ignored her and began to walk away, clearly irritated. His decision was final, and he didn't want to discuss the matter any further. Artesia realized it wasn't a good idea to intervene at this point. Lawrence was too tense and unprepared for further discussion. It was best to leave him alone and let him sort out his feelings in silence. While she was lost in thought, a maid approached her, asking with concern in her voice if everything was all right. She noticed the change in the atmosphere and the worry on her mistress's face that had appeared after the last scene. Artesia regretfully admitted that she didn't think what was happening was normal. Alice, observing her reaction, added that the man was clearly irritated and left without hiding his anger. This only increased her anxiety. The lady didn't answer immediately. She stared silently into her cup, clearly lost in her thoughts. Her silence was entirely natural, as she understood that everything that was happening was perfectly within the normal time frame for this time. After a while, the maid spoke again, remarking that perhaps it was time to return. After all, quite a bit of time had passed since they arrived, and the situation might need to be resolved. But Artesia, without looking at her, suggested they wait a bit. She felt like not everything was over yet, and there was no need to rush into leaving, as something important could still happen. The maid, noticing the arrival of the guests, raised her eyebrows in surprise. According to her, the man had already left this place long ago, and there was no point in waiting for him any longer. All waiting at this point was in vain. It was already dark outside, and soon Benjamin Connor, a representative of the Western Army, was walking in their direction, appearing as if from the very shadows of the street, his silhouette barely visible in the evening gloom. He conveyed with restraint and precision that, by Duke Yfon's orders, he was obliged to escort Lady Marquise to her home. His voice conveyed a firm conviction that he would carry out the task, despite the late hour. As they navigated the dark streets, they were suddenly stopped. One of the strangers passing by signaled, and it was clear this wasn't just a delay, but something far more significant was happening. The coachman, keeping a close eye on the situation, obediently braked. Artesia immediately sensed the tension in the air. Something was clearly wrong, and her intuition told her that trouble lay ahead. One of the men conducting the search noticed the Western Army uniform on the man accompanying them. He immediately inquired what a representative of that army was doing here, on this street. Introducing himself as a knight of the 4th Corps of the Western Army, he announced that he had received orders from Duke Rods to accompany Lady Marquise Rosanna on her journey. His words were firm and convincing. The man, despite his interlocutor's confidence, was genuinely surprised and doubted the veracity of such an important order coming from Archduke Yfon himself. He didn't immediately accept it. As he approached the carriage, his gaze immediately fell on the girl, and she recognized him. A slight smile flickered across her face, and she, without hiding her joy, expressed her pleasure at meeting this acquaintance. He asked her a cautious question, trying to find out where she was returning from at such a late hour, and whether it was dangerous for her to be alone. The girl, without hiding her fatigue, replied that she had been in the temple and, carried away by prayers, had completely lost track of time. Despite her explanations, the man was left wondering what a person with a Western army was doing in this place at such a late hour. Then the girl said that her carriage had broken down, and Archduke Ephron happened to be nearby, helped, and sent Sir Connor with her. The man, with a warm note in his voice, noted that Mrs. Artesia had already grown up completely, becoming a real lady. His words confused the girl, and a slight blush flashed across her face, betraying timid excitement. He added that he would personally escort her home, after which the soldier from the Western Corps nodded and went about his business. The girl approached Sir Connor with a proposal. If he didn't mind, let him come to her and stay for a cup of tea. The gentleman confidently declared that no one was safer than a royal guardsman. Since he had completed his task, he was now allowed to return. The girl said she'd been given prayer candles at the temple. She'd like to give them to the Lord's daughter, Lady Meal, so she could light them in her chambers. The man thanked her from the bottom of his heart. A warm smile appeared on his face, conveying genuine appreciation for her concern. She was just hoping to have a little picnic with Lady Meal once she got better. She planned to bring Sir along too, to make things more fun for them. The gentleman remarked that the child had become quite importunate of late, but the lady gently dismissed his words, considering it unlikely. Then he smiled again and admitted that it would be wonderful if his remarks turned out to be merely an exaggeration and not the truth. However, the fact that Sir Kishon was nearby could only mean one thing. His Majesty was also somewhere near this place. The lady turned to Alice and ordered that the prepared gift bags be distributed to each of the chamberlains serving at the imperial court. All the gifts and decorations that had been prepared in advance had to be thrown away because the situation had changed and they were no longer needed. But the lady remained calm and believed that everything was proceeding as usual. She saw no cause for alarm despite the changes. Then one of the maids bowed, expressing her understanding. She accepted the order and hastened to carry it out without further question. The girl asked me to convey that Artesia, Nalaira's daughter, had arrived at the palace to personally pay her respects and greet the emperor. The knights strictly indicated that only the back could pass inside to the emperor. Apparently this was a test or a special access code. First, she thanked them for their attention, and then quietly entered the room assigned to her, preparing for the meeting and a little nervous. Suddenly, she remembered something and wondered if they could let her know if anyone decided to come in while she was inside. The men were surprised by such an unusual question and even asked again. They hadn't expected the mistress to suddenly ask this, breaking with their usual routine. Artesia noticed that the emperor did not want their meeting to be interrupted by either her mother or anyone else, and so she herself made sure that no one disturbed them. The men caught her mood and, not wanting to spoil the atmosphere, readily agreed to do as she asked, without asking unnecessary questions. Artesia bowed in respect, adding that such a great luminary as the son of the empire had illuminated their humble family home for the first time. She introduced herself as befits etiquette, Artesia, Nalaira's daughter, and had come only to express her respect and wish her long, peaceful years of life. The emperor noted with a degree of surprise how much the girl had changed during the time they had not seen each other, and how much she had matured in appearance and manners. With a smile, he added that if she were more like her mother, she could be even more beautiful, and Nalaira, hearing this, admitted with playful pride that she knew she was irresistible. The emperor casually asked how old Artesia would be this year, as if testing how quickly time was flying. The girl answered calmly and with dignity that she was about to turn 18, and her voice sounded confident and calm. The emperor nodded reservedly, noting that she had already become an adult, and it was time to think about a worthy match for a future marriage. But his mother did not share his views. She believed that 18 was too early, and Artesia was not yet ready for serious commitments. The emperor understood what Nalaira wanted, to keep his daughter with him as long as possible, but he reminded her that by 20 she should at least be engaged. He assured her that he would find a suitable groom for her, since it was not wise to keep the girl forever close to her brother. She deserved her own path. Artesia nodded gratefully, but at that very moment, one of the guards silently entered the hall, immediately interrupting their conversation. Leaning closer, he whispered a short message to Artesia. The man she had been waiting for had arrived. It couldn't be ignored. The emperor, seeing no reason to detain her, made it clear with a slight movement of his hand that she could be free to go about her business. Artesia politely apologized to everyone and, without losing her dignity, announced that she had to leave immediately since they were already waiting for her. The guards reported that Countess Eunice had made a violent scene right at the entrance, clearly trying to get inside and see someone who was especially important to her. The girl only nodded briefly, showing that she wanted to sort out the situation herself, and asked not to interfere anymore. One of the guards nevertheless asked whether she knew in advance that the woman would decide to come today without warning. The lady met his gaze calmly, confirming the assumption with a cold, almost icy expression on her face. She had indeed been expecting this visit, and so the guards considered her a woman of remarkable insight and strength. The butler began to justify himself, saying that if everything had gone according to the rules, this scene could have been avoided altogether. But the girl no longer understood why, being the emperor's daughter, she couldn't simply meet him without obstacles. Artesia left and, noticing the unusual events unfolding in the room, paused in bewilderment, unable to comprehend what had caused the countess's violent and vehement reaction. She couldn't help but notice what was happening. The countess, unable to restrain herself, suddenly raised her hand and struck her mistress hard across the face, making no attempt to hide her anger or emotion, which seemed unexpected to everyone nearby. Every gesture was filled with irritation. Artesia was stunned by such a sudden action. She couldn't figure out how to react to such an unexpected gesture. Her brain couldn't process what had just happened, and she was lost in her search for the next step. Everyone around, the maids and the guards, was in complete shock, not expecting such violence within these walls, which seemed to be a symbol of order and respect. Surprise gripped everyone. Then the countess, even more furiously, exclaimed, ordering Artesia's mother to be summoned immediately. She brooked no objections and insisted on her own way, expressing her impatience and demanding that her will be carried out. Artesia assumed her mother was a woman prone to frivolous behavior, and the countess clearly didn't grasp the full depth of the situation. It was hard to imagine that what was happening could have shaken her so much. Artesia added that the slap was delivered in front of witnesses, the court chamberlains who served under the emperor. This should have deterred anyone hoping for a diplomatic solution. The woman couldn't understand why her actions were being so condemned, but Artesia reminded her that the emperor did not tolerate noise and conflict, always striving for peace and order, especially in such important matters. Moreover, what man would like it if his daughter burst in during a secret date and started screaming? Artesia is no longer a baby just learning to crawl. She is now married and a mother herself, with the responsibilities and experience of an adult woman. She caught an important detail. If she made a scene because of Borea and the shame, it might well force the emperor to leave his chambers and intervene. Malaera, her mother, would have immediately seized the opportunity. She would have cried demonstratively, ignoring the lady herself, and would have hastened to complain to His Majesty. And the countess undoubtedly understood what consequences would follow if this scene of Artesia's mother's humiliation reached the emperor. The angry woman screamed, demanding that the girl behave decently and not forget herself in the presence of her elders. But Artesia noticed that the more rudely the mistress treated her mother, the more obvious it became who was really cruel and unfair. This means that the emperor will involuntarily begin to sympathize with Artesia and her mother simply by comparing the behavior of both sides. That's why she calmly asked the woman if she was sure she wanted to bring things to this turn of events. She flared up with rage, but it didn't lead to a real explosion. Her maid grabbed her hand in time, holding her back. Artesia took advantage of this moment and, holding the woman by the wrist, strongly advised her to return to her place immediately. The countess was amazed. She could not understand how this girl dared to order her, a countess of high position. She coldly stated that if Artesia was so confident in herself, then let her try, and we'll see how it all ends. But Artesia calmly reminded him that Countess Eunice was nothing more than a noblewoman, and could not compare to the one whom the emperor himself idolized. She is only the daughter of His Majesty, who was recognized out of duty, but not out of great love, and certainly not out of admiration. And if her mother was once displaced, this does not mean that love has disappeared. It has simply now taken a different form. These words frightened the woman a little. She stepped back nervously, looking at the girl with confusion and distrust. Artesia explained that, if she began to be perceived as the daughter of the emperor's beloved woman, then memories of this could resurface. And it is she, Artesia, who is able to revive in her father's memory that very connection that he once had with her mother. This means that she can be accepted and loved by her father again if she behaves wisely and with dignity. The woman didn't understand anything. Her gaze was full of incomprehension, as if a crazy but dangerous intriguer stood before her. Artesia quietly made it clear that she would forget this incident and that it would not come up again if no one wanted it to continue. She made it clear that every parent would avoid a situation in which their child would see them with their mistress, and the countess knew that this was true. The servants were given orders. Countess Eunice was returning to her estate, and their task was to accompany her, ensuring all due respect along the way. Everyone hoped that everything would be fine with Mrs. Artesia and that no more misunderstandings would disturb her peace and authority. The lady reminded him that he should not interfere with His Majesty's leisure time. Such things require tact and do not allow for arbitrariness. She turned to Countess Eunice and ordered her to go back immediately, reminding her of the respect for her parents that must not be forgotten. The woman was shocked to the depths of her soul when she heard such serious words from the lips of a young girl who behaved unexpectedly, firmly. The man walked the Countess out, and all this time she kept throwing irritated glances at the girl, full of reproach and inner annoyance. Countess Eunice was not a particularly influential woman. Her authority was small, especially compared to more powerful women. Her mother had power and reputation, while Eunice was more of a nuisance whom they tried to get rid of so as not to interfere at court. Her behavior had to be impeccable, otherwise she might incur the emperor's displeasure, which would be disastrous. At that moment, the emperor appeared. He noticed that Charlotte had recently been here, and this immediately attracted his attention. He then looked at Artesia and, realizing the potential awkwardness of the situation, decided to apologize to her for what had happened. Artesia calmly assured him that nothing terrible had happened and, showing respect, bowed her head politely. She added that Countess Eunice, in her grief for her late father, had made a mistake, but she could not be judged harshly for it. However, despite her compassion, Artesia recalled that the Countess had hit her daughter in her own home, and that was difficult to forgive. She admitted that she also grew up without a father, and understands the pain of loss, so she sympathizes with the feelings that Eunice is experiencing. But because of this melancholy, a painful feeling of jealousy appeared towards her mother, the woman who was supposed to become the next mistress. Artesia promised that everything would be perfectly fine and that nothing would disturb His Highness's peace. In her opinion, making a fuss over a trifle was completely unnecessary. The Duke smiled warmly, remembering how her desire to appear helpful had always earned him respect. But in his opinion, Charlotte had been raised improperly. Though beautiful, she was too hot-tempered. He couldn't believe a mother of 3 was acting so frivolously. It was time to be reasonable, not to leave marks on the faces of young girls in their prime. He believed she had the right to ask him for whatever she wanted. This would be his birthday gift to her, a sign of respect and gratitude for everything. The girl modestly apologized for being late and, without wasting any time, asked him to accept the gift. She wanted him to appreciate what she had prepared especially for him. At first, the emperor didn't understand what gift she was talking about. Clearly surprised, he asked again, trying to process what she had just heard and figure out what exactly she had given him. Artesia explained that the gift was actually intended for her mother. Through this gesture, she wanted to express her gratitude for the life she had been given. It was a paired item intended as a symbol for her parents, but since she had no one left to accept the other half, she decided to give it to him. She couldn't look her mother in the eye and give it to her, but if he accepted the gift, she would be truly grateful for this important step. The emperor realized that since it was about his parents, the gift must be connected to him and Milera. This aroused his curiosity and certain feelings. He then asked her if she had considered that they might not accept such a gift. He then ordered her to bring it quickly without delay. When they finally opened the box, the expressions of surprise on their faces were noticeable. The gift was unexpected and even a little shocking. A brooch the color of old gold lay on a velvet cushion. The emperor handed it over, remarking that it was astonishingly beautiful, a rare work, worthy only of the chosen few. Artesia bowed hesitantly before him, lowering her head. Her gesture was cautious, almost measured, as if she were trying to figure out how best to act. He noticed her wariness and told her to relax. She raised her head slowly, and despite her best efforts to hide her emotions, her fingers trembled treacherously with anxiety, betraying her state. The emperor said with restraint that she was Milera's daughter, and therefore almost like his own. It seemed that this statement was more about blood than any other connection or relationship. Artesia caught her breath, her voice barely audible as she declared that it was truly an honor. Then she bowed again, deeper this time, her movement carrying something new, something full of respect. The emperor nodded briefly and added that they should now go to the opera. His words were calm, but there was something in them that suggested the moment was over, as if everything had been decided and the time had come. Milera said with a slight smile that she had been looking forward to this evening. Artesia remained in her place, clutching the box, her gaze fixed forward, but overwhelmed with emotion. Only when the footsteps outside the door faded did Artesia allow herself to turn around. All this time she had been standing there as if invisible forces were holding her back, preventing her from taking a single step until the moment for change arrived. Once upon a time, she dreamed of hearing him say something that would confirm that he considered her his daughter. In her childhood fantasies, it was something incredible, like the fulfillment of her most cherished dream. Now the word family seemed distant and non-existent to her. It was like a beautiful but deceptive fairy tale from which she had long ago awakened, finding nothing but emptiness and deception. Despite this, even the fleeting sense of duty that flashed in his gaze was a victory for her. It was the first time he felt he owed her even a little, and it brought her some comfort. Meanwhile, Cedric stood outside the door, lost in thought, gazing at the gray, cloud-covered sky. The wind fluttered his cloak restlessly, but he remained motionless, as if awaiting an answer from the sky itself. He recalled the lady's words, spoken many years ago. To bring peace to the people of the Krates Empire, he needed to take the throne. He had to do it for them, for their future, to bring peace and tranquility. More than 20 years have passed since the day his parents were executed. They were falsely accused of treason, but no one stood up to defend their names, and this left a deep wound in Cedric's heart. After that, many came to him, begging him to become a leader, to ascend the throne, to avenge his family and restore their losses. But Cedric wouldn't listen. He didn't want to be part of what led to his family's demise. Instead of giving in to these requests, he preferred to remain on the sidelines, not interfering in politics. He considered it alien and cruel, and all it brought was destruction and pain to the people. His apparent indifference to politics and disregard for imperial affairs wasn't due to laziness. He did it deliberately, as if he were using a shield to protect his family. She acted differently. Her actions were dictated by concern for the people. Everything she did was neither revenge nor a struggle for survival, but a sincere desire for the common good. And when he became emperor, it was not for glory or power, but only to make life easier for his subjects, to preserve the country, and to protect its inhabitants from destruction and pain. The morning began with a servant approaching him and carefully noting that the master had not slept a wink all night, and fatigue was evident in his gaze. To this, the gentleman admitted that sleep had indeed not come to him, and the servant, without insisting, simply suggested that he lie down for a while and regain his strength, at least for a short time. However, the gentleman firmly refused. He said there was no time for that now. An important day lay ahead, and he couldn't afford a moment's rest. Today he was supposed to go to the palace to meet the Marchioness Rosanna's daughter again. He wanted to ask her just one question, but it was an important one. Meanwhile, Archduke Cedric requested a personal audience with His Majesty. He did not dare enter without permission. The Emperor was a little surprised to hear who exactly was requesting the meeting, but without hesitation, he ordered Cedric to be admitted immediately without keeping him waiting at the door. The doors creaked open, and Cedric entered the room. His steps were calm, but every movement spoke of an inner resolve and anxiety hidden behind his outward restraint. The Emperor gestured to a seat nearby and invited Cedric to come closer. He explained that he was currently taking a short break and was willing to listen to him at his leisure in a calm setting. Cedric, approaching, immediately apologized, feeling somewhat awkward. He didn't want to disturb the Emperor's peace, but he considered his request important enough to put everything else aside. He added that if he had known Countess Eunice was present, he certainly would not have disturbed the Emperor, even if the matter had been urgent. He respected the importance of her presence and would have preferred to wait. The Emperor, smiling, asked with unexpected kindness why Cedric looked so gloomy. He noticed that he had always been more lively and open, and now it was much more noticeable. He reminded them that Charlotte was his daughter and Cedric his nephew, and that they were essentially one family. They were bound not only by blood but also by fate, and their relationship should be strong and trusting. It was hard for Cedric to hear such words, for it was this man who had once accused his parents of treason and sentenced them to death. The weight of that tragedy was still etched in his memory. The Emperor, continuing the conversation, expressed confidence that the relationship between Cedric and his cousin would work out well, just as his own relationship with Artesia had. He believed there would be no problems. Cedric, a little surprised, asked if they were talking about Lady Rosanna. He couldn't understand the reason for such assumptions. The Emperor, confirming his suspicions, noted that he himself had recently introduced the knight to Rosanna so that he could escort her home. Everything had gone perfectly according to plan. The Duke said there was nothing unusual about it. He noted that the Emperor was probably already aware of all the events since they had met by chance in the temple, and she had no knight. The Emperor added that he had recently arrived from the outskirts of the capital, and he now wished to state that his current visit had absolutely nothing to do with Lady Rosanna. The Duke didn't respond to this, but continued to watch the proceedings closely. The Emperor looked somewhat tense, as if he were hiding something. At that moment, the Emperor laughed and slapped him playfully on the knee. He couldn't help but notice that at times the Emperor's honesty was almost frightening. The Duke, supporting the Emperor, said that if the meeting took place today, it would be wonderful. He was delighted at the opportunity despite all the difficulties. He also announced that he had come here not because of Lady Rosanna, but about the Western Army. This topic was far more important to him and required immediate discussion. The Emperor, abruptly interrupting him, asked if he understood why the Emperor had decided to receive him here, and not in his office now. The question was unexpected and direct. The Duke stood there, a little confused, unsure why the Emperor had reacted this way. He hadn't expected such a turn of events and couldn't understand what could have caused such a reaction. After some time, the Emperor said with a smile that it was not worth discussing important matters in the presence of the family, since such conversations required a special mood and privacy to make the right decisions. He proposed postponing the discussion for 3 days, when everyone could gather under more suitable conditions. This was important to avoid unnecessary misunderstandings and omissions. The Emperor added with a slight smile that there was no need to worry about him forgetting the contribution of the Western Army, since this event had already been discussed and carefully thought out many times. He then served Cedric the tea himself, pouring it with the care and delicacy befitting one who appreciates the importance of these small details in communication. It was his usual gesture of attention. The Emperor's majesty clearly changed after he learned of his meeting with Lady Rosanna. This moment left a mark on him that influenced his behavior and attitude toward others. At Rosanne's estate, Cedric was met by a servant who greeted him politely, showing his willingness to help and serve as his position in this house required. Cedric inquired where the lady had gone, and the servant informed him that it seemed she had gone about her business. He himself wasn't sure of the exact route, but he could point out a possible direction. After a while, another maid confirmed that Lady Rosanne had gone to the bean to see Count Ender. This was a significant event, as everyone present understood that meeting the Count carried considerable weight. The servant immediately apologized to the Duke and offered to return the lady immediately if he would allow time. He was ready to clear up the misunderstanding by quickly completing his task. Cedric looked at him with bewilderment and asked if his position in Rosanne's household was truly superior to hers. This was a surprising moment for him, causing him to question his full status. The man was surprised by the question and asked Cedric what he meant. He was certain that all the responsibilities in the house were clearly assigned and such questions should not arise. Cedric explained that the Marquis's daughter, Rose, was the heir to the estate, a fact beyond dispute. He, in turn, had no right to tell her what to do in this house. Cedric added that, as a butler, he could only oversee order, not interfere in matters that concerned Rosanne herself. This was an important adjustment in his approach to matters of authority. The servant bowed and stated that he had merely thought that, since young Lawrence would soon return, it might be appropriate to have a little chat with him before the lady arrived. He was perplexed by his mistake. Then Cedric, realizing the situation, said that this could mean he was mistaken. He wanted to emphasize that everything had to be done in order, and there was no point in rushing into decisions before the lady arrived. Cedric paused and added that he had probably misjudged the butler in Rosanne's house, thinking he was someone else. He recognized the misunderstanding and tried to clear things up. He suggested that the man the butler was speaking to might actually be Lord Lawrence's butler, not the owner of Rosanne's estate. This opened up new perspectives in their conversation and made everything more confusing. The butler, realizing his mistake, immediately began to apologize, bowing to Cedric, and tried to correct his behavior, understanding that his place in the house must remain clearly defined and subject to higher orders. Then the gentleman, recalling his conversation with Artesia, realized that she had long planned to acquire all of the Marquis Rosanne's property. She strove for independence, and now that was becoming clear. She'd asked him to protect her by marrying her for 2 years. That had been her condition, and now he realized why she'd suggested it. She was clearly up to something. Now that he thought about it, it became clear to him why she had asked for his protection. Meanwhile, everyone at Count Ender's estate continued to revel, but Our Lady remained aloof. While others enjoyed dancing and conversation, the lady stood alone, absorbed in her thoughts. She was not part of the festivities and kept her distance from everyone. At one point, a young woman approached her, curious about her condition, and asked why the Marchioness looked so sad. Lady Rosanna was a little surprised, but didn't immediately answer. The Marchioness, turning, realized that Lady Artia, the Countess, stood before her. She recognized her by her mannerisms, but hadn't expected to meet her at such a moment. It was difficult to respond, but she began the conversation anyway. Artia noticed that the Marquise had arrived at the ball earlier than everyone else, but had still not danced with a single man. This didn't escape her notice, and she noted the fact with a smile. Artesia quietly remarked that someone should stand back, decorate the walls, and observe the proceedings. The Countess smiled, understanding her words, but added that she might be exaggerating. She continued that her words sounded as if they brought her sadness. All the men in the room seemed callous and unmannered, which truly couldn't help but upset the lady. But suddenly, the Countess smiled sharply and added that perhaps Lady Rosanna herself was partly to blame. Her words, despite all the irony, were not without meaning. The Countess pointed out that if Lady Rosanna came to the ball in a dress she'd already worn 4 times, she couldn't expect any special attention from the gentlemen. They might not even notice that this wasn't her first time wearing that outfit. She noted that the men would definitely not be able to tell whether they had danced with her at this ball or the last one. Such a repeat of her outfit was bound to raise doubts, and perhaps even disappointment. After her words, everyone present began to laugh, but the lady didn't find it funny. Her gaze remained serious, and she continued to stand aside, not sharing in the general mirth. The men, observing the situation, realized that the Marquise had indeed worn the same dress for the 4th time. This gave them cause for laughter, and everyone began exchanging glances, noticing her attire. Laughter echoed throughout the hall, and the girl watching couldn't help but notice how loudly everyone was laughing. The lady stood among them, but her face didn't reveal the slightest trace of a smile. Afterwards, Artesia smiled, remarking that it didn't matter how much the dress cost if it was a waste of several 100,000 gold coins. After all, with her ugly appearance, such an outfit couldn't make her any more beautiful. Artesia also added that she particularly liked the embroidery on this dress, although she would have ventured to guess that it was from the Southern Kingdom. The style was unique and different from the others. She believed that such exquisite gowns should only be worn by well-bred ladies like herself, otherwise the designer's work would be devalued. It was a source of particular pride for those who wore such dresses. Then Ms. Artia, smiling, remarked that Artesia was very perceptive and emphasized her attentiveness. Her perception of the world around her was excellent, as was her ability to notice details. Artesia became intrigued and asked if everything was truly so good. She expected an answer that would dispel her doubts or confirm her opinion, but her curiosity wasn't immediately satisfied. Ms. Artia immediately understood what Artesia was talking about and asked her exactly what she meant. Understanding flashed in her eyes, and she was ready to explain anything that might interest the girl. Artesia explained that embroidery made from Jan's velvet is so expensive that if she used it generously, the cost of the fabric alone could amount to a fortune. It was a truly luxurious and rare choice. From what she'd seen, this was the 4th dress embroidered with this material. The dress was gorgeous but extremely expensive, and it was clear that the cost of a single such piece could rival a fortune. If this is true, then Count Artia apparently spends almost half of his estate's annual income on just one dress for his lady. This was too noticeable and raised eyebrows. After these words, the Countess was completely horrified and asked again what exactly they were talking about. She couldn't believe they were talking about such a massive expenditure, and her surprise was entirely justified. Then the lady, smiling, added that the Count and Countess must have loved me very much, since they hadn't told her the cost of these dresses. This was a subtle hint at the hidden care and attention they paid to her outfits. Apparently there was a deep affection behind it all, otherwise no one would be able to afford such high clothing costs. The lady casually mentioned how much they valued her without focusing on her reaction. The Count's main source of income was his marble quarrying business. However, over time, it became threatened with closure. Within a year or 2, it will likely cease to exist due to a sharp decline in capital. Profit margins had fallen significantly, and they were currently on the brink of bankruptcy. The Countess was aware of this and apparently expected the worst, as the situation seemed critical. It was a bitter truth. The money they continued to spend seemed like a waste of money that wasn't worth it. Everyone saw the situation deteriorating and knew it would only get worse. However, the lady noted that if this was an investment in the family's future, the amount really wasn't that large. Perhaps this wasn't the end, but merely temporary difficulties to be endured. She added with a smile that, with such beauty, the Countess would certainly live up to all her parents' expectations. These words were meant to encourage the girl, but there was something insincere and somewhat overly pompous about them. The Countess exploded with rage, believing the Marquise was hinting that her parents might sell her. This sparked a storm of emotion, and she was unable to hide her irritation, which attracted the attention of those around her. The Countess's anger was so intense that she couldn't contain it. All eyes were on her, and her flamboyant reaction attracted even more attention. The entire room felt the tension. At that moment, the door opened and someone entered the room. The question immediately arose as to why he had suddenly decided to show up, as his appearance had been unexpected for everyone present. It was Archduke Ephron. His Majesty entered the hall with a noble air, attracting everyone's attention. Everyone in the room immediately realized his presence was no accident, and they began to wonder who he was and why he had come. Everyone began to bow to him. The Countess, noticing him, was taken aback, for the Archduke was extraordinarily handsome. Her face turned red with embarrassment, and the entire hall's attention focused on him. Archduke Ephron greeted the Countess, and then the mother of the girl with whom the Marquise had been arguing. His manners were polite and dignified, further heightening the interest of all present. Everyone was chatting curiously, wondering why he had come. Rumors had it that His Majesty wasn't particularly fond of women, and everyone expected his presence to explain everything. They suspected that someone present might have been acquainted with His Majesty. However, no one knew for sure the reason for his visit, which only added to the mystery of the entire situation. The Archduke walked toward the Marquise and Countess. The Countess, slightly embarrassed, greeted him joyfully, though her inner turmoil was obvious. She was ready to do anything to attract his attention. She bowed, but the Archduke passed her by without noticing. It was unexpected, and she felt her heart clench. It seemed she had become insignificant in his presence. Everyone was shocked to realize the Archduke had headed toward the Marquise Rosanna's daughter. This unexpected reaction sent shockwaves through those present. No one expected his attention to be focused specifically on her. The Archduke approached and, smiling, greeted the girl. His greeting was friendly, but there was something more to it. Everyone noticed that a special rapport had developed between them. He offered her his hand, and the girl took it with understanding. It was clear she couldn't hide her confusion, but her gaze expressed interest. She was genuinely puzzled by what was happening. She timidly offered his hand and asked him what had brought him here. The question was no accident. The girl couldn't understand what had prompted the Archduke's sudden and strange visit. Archia was horrified. Everything that was happening was a complete surprise to her. She felt gossip swirling around her, and every minute became more tense and difficult to understand. The Duke looked at the girl carefully, then carefully turned her face toward him, trying to discern her expression. He couldn't figure out what was wrong with her appearance. It puzzled him. The lady, looking up, couldn't understand what exactly he was talking about. She couldn't immediately grasp what could have caused such a reaction in him, since at first glance, everything seemed normal. The Duke, noticing the changes on her face, immediately noticed that her cheek looked swollen and there were nail marks on her skin. He also noticed that the corner of her mouth was injured, which worried him. After these remarks, the Marquise lowered her head, hiding her face from his gaze, as if worried that the Duke had noticed her condition. She found it awkward and painful, and her silence spoke of her embarrassment. She didn't answer him, and this silenced the Duke, leaving him room to think. He felt her silence only heighten the tension in the room, and he didn't know what to say next. Coming closer, the Duke asked her if these traces had really been left by Countess Eunice. He had met her at the palace that day, they had gotten to talking, and she had conveyed her apologies for the Marchioness. But things weren't that simple. He explained that Countess Eunice had asked him to convey her apologies for what had happened, but all of this seemed insignificant to Artesia in the context of what was happening in her life at that moment. Artesia, containing her irritation, asked him not to talk nonsense, as she was already facing serious problems. Her situation was too complex to waste time on useless talk of apologies. Turning, the Duke announced that he now had to return. His words elicited no objections from the Marquise, who merely nodded, indicating her agreement with his decision. He returned and glanced again at Countess Artia, who stood nearby, quietly waiting. The Countess, with a sweet and open face, addressed the Duke, her words catching his attention. The Countess, smiling modestly, apologized to the Duke for her unexpected behavior, explaining that she was from the county of Artia. This added a certain elegance to her appearance, but she was clearly not one to be overly courteous. She remarked that it was not proper for a gentleman to come to a ball and then leave without dancing at least one part, especially if there was a lady at the ball who could not dance a single dance. Cedric, hearing her words, looked at Artesia, then back at the Countess. He might have ignored her, but her remarks caught his attention. A flicker of interest flashed in his eyes, but he left the question open. He paused for a moment and then replied that he agreed that a gentleman should behave differently, especially when there was a lady nearby who, for whatever reason, could not take part in the dance. This left a special impression. After this, Cedric turned to Artesia, then back to the Countess. He was clearly interested in her answer, though he didn't express it openly. His gaze was full of thought and a hint of mystery. He asked her if she was a friend of Lady Marquise Rosanna. This was quite unexpected for the girl, and her reaction to this question was full of surprise. She hadn't expected such a direct question. The Countess smiled and confirmed that it was indeed true. She was a friend of the Marchioness Rosanna. The answer was simple, but its sincerity and slight smile made her seem more approachable and open to her interlocutor. Then the Duke, glancing at her, remarked that, in his opinion, a gentleman's most important duty was to take care of a lady, especially in awkward situations. He wanted to clarify that if she really was Rosanna's friend, she should be concerned. He wanted to clarify whether she really was the Marquise's friend, for if so, her behavior should be slightly different. He hoped she wasn't just observing, but also felt responsible. The Countess, clearly puzzled by the question, asked him again, unsure how exactly she should respond to such a remark. It confused her and made her feel a little uneasy. The Duke, noticing her surprise, replied that if she truly was the Marquise's friend, she should be concerned, not just watching. He said this with a hint of irony, not hiding his opinion. Artesia was shocked by what was happening around her. A commotion filled the air, and everyone began to fuss, trying to attract attention to themselves. The girl felt a nervous tension creeping over her. In a panic, she grabbed the hand of the gentleman who was next to her and felt his palm wrapped tightly around hers. Although Artesia looked incredibly beautiful, her face was haggard. It became obvious that she wasn't receiving the care she needed, which had a significant impact on her appearance. For the ball, she chose the same dress she'd worn for the previous day's walk. This outfit, while beautiful, was clearly unsuitable for such an important event. Her wrist was so fragile that, looking at it, one could see the line of fate, as if on a thin, barely noticeable stick. She bore absolutely no resemblance to the heiress of the Marchioness Rosanna. There was nothing in her appearance that would inspire respect and trust. He was even afraid to imagine how they really treated her in her house, if they allowed themselves such disdain. That's why he decided to turn to Lady Rosanna, which greatly surprised her. This gesture came as a surprise to everyone nearby. He asked if he could invite her to a dance performance. It seemed his request was sincere, and he didn't expect a refusal. When the Countess heard the Duke offer to dance not with her but with the Marquise, she was absolutely horrified. Such behavior was unacceptable to her. Artesia remained silent at first and lowered her head. A faint cloud of doubt passed through her thoughts. She didn't know what to do. The entire hall was in shock. His Majesty was about to dance, and most surprisingly, with this girl who didn't fit into this world at all. Artesia quietly told him that she didn't want to attract too much attention, and so she tried to back away, but she felt inside that she shouldn't do that. The Duke said she'd already attracted attention, so she had nothing to lose. He added that her reserve only heightened the interest. He also noted that there was no need to worry because he was an Archduke and was quite capable of being a good dance companion for her. The Duke insisted, and gradually the lady began to think. He was so persistent that she could hardly resist his request. She finally agreed and extended her hand to him, saying that she might accidentally step on his foot, as she was not an experienced dancer. All this happened because she never took dance lessons, and her skills in this matter were far from perfect. The Duke stated that in this case, they would be able to forgive each other generously, despite all the misunderstandings and disagreements that had arisen in their relationship. This would be an important step for both parties. He admitted he couldn't dance himself and said this to encourage her, as he noticed she was a little nervous. His words were meant to ease her doubts and help her relax. Within moments, they were both engrossed in the dance, moving smoothly across the room. Their movements merged into one, creating an elegant and harmonious picture, captivating everyone's attention. The entire audience watched them intently, unable to tear their eyes away from the way they danced together. Even the most experienced dancers couldn't help but notice how perfectly they harmonized in this moment. Everyone was shocked. Such a combination of grace and confidence seemed rare. Moreover, they looked so harmonious that anyone could have assumed they were a couple who had danced together their entire lives. As Cedric danced with her, a genuine smile lit up his face. He was clearly content, feeling both comfort and joy at having shared such a special moment with her. The lady gazed silently into his eyes, her gaze confident and calm. Her green eyes seemed to sparkle, as if trying to convey all her thoughts without words, maintaining a sense of mystery in this dance. Everything around them seemed to vanish, and only the two of them remained in the empty ballroom. At that moment, the entire world seemed to shrink to their movements, and all attention was focused on their dance, creating an atmosphere of solitude. Last time, it was completely different. They'd danced together before, but the atmosphere had been different. It was at a different point in their lives, and there was a completely different energy between them now. Cedric remarked that last time he thought she couldn't dance, as he'd never seen her do it. This observation surprised him a little, as she was doing much better than he'd expected. The lady in turn noticed that he himself wasn't dancing. Her gaze was intense, and she couldn't help but emphasize that he was the one avoiding dancing at that moment. She noted this with a slight ironic smile. The gentleman reminded her that he had a favor to ask, which was why he'd asked her to dance. It was more than just a polite gesture, and his intentions behind the invitation didn't escape her notice. She replied that he could speak since they were the center of attention and no one was distracted. The lady didn't hide her interest and willingness to listen, though her eyes were full of questions, awaiting further explanation. Then he declared that she must take care of Lucia. His request was direct and clear, but its meaning remained unclear. Why she of all people should take on this responsibility was a mystery to her. Artesia was surprised and, without hiding her curiosity, asked him why he was making such a request of her. The question was sincere, and her confusion at that moment was entirely natural. The gentleman replied that he couldn't trust Lawrence and therefore asked her for help in resolving the matter. He sought her support, knowing that her judgment would be objective and fair. At that moment, Artesia began to realize he simply trusted her. This revelation slightly altered her perception of the entire situation, and she sensed that his request wasn't so much about trust as about faith in her abilities. But the Duke, recognizing the complexity of the situation, added that he was aware of her efforts to legitimize Lawrence. He spoke of this with a hint of doubt, as she had genuinely tried everything possible to ensure Lucia's marriage. Ultimately, he noted that whatever her attitude toward Lucia, it was her decision. No matter how difficult it was, Lucia's decision contained the whole truth, and no one could influence her choice. The Duke realized he had nothing more to say and fell silent. He watched the situation closely, but his words no longer found a resonance in this conversation. A thoughtful look appeared in his eyes. For him, this girl was more than just an acquaintance or a subject. He saw her as a younger sister, whom he wanted to protect and defend from all harm. The Duke frankly admitted that he was prepared to do everything possible to preserve the security of not only the Empire, but also Lycia and everything connected to it. This was his most important task. Artesia asked in surprise how she could pretend she hadn't heard him. The Duke's words left her somewhat confused. All this reminded her of the events of the past days, when everything developed according to a similar scenario, and she had already witnessed similar conversations more than once. Of course, nothing happened, and they remained where they started. Moments that seemed important had no real consequences. At that moment, unexpectedly for everyone, the lady accidentally stepped on his foot, causing an immediate shift in her balance. She began to fall, which immediately attracted the attention of everyone around her. Artesia panicked, realizing she was about to fall, and her heart pounded with fear. Everything was happening too fast for her to have time to do anything. But, to her great relief, the gentleman managed to grab her hand, preventing her fall. It was a tense moment, but everything turned out all right. At that moment, they both sparkled, their gazes intertwined. Everyone around them held their breath for a moment, watching this exquisite scene. The entire congregation was in complete shock. They couldn't believe it had happened. They began to applaud, delighted by what they had just witnessed. No one knew His Highness could dance so skillfully. The couple looked stunning together, and everyone marveled at how harmoniously they danced. Then the gentleman, with a light remark, noted that his dancing skills might be slightly superior to hers. His words were full of lightness and self-irony. The girl replied with a smile that it was difficult to compare her dancing skills with those of such an outstanding dancer as His Highness. These words made him smile, and a slight irony appeared on his face. He chuckled quietly, and genuine amusement was evident in his eyes. A few moments later, his smile turned into a loud laugh. He couldn't contain the joyful mood that swept over him at that moment. Soon he escorted her to the carriage. This moment concluded their meeting, leaving a pleasant impression and a slight feeling that something important had happened between them. The girl was very grateful to him. She couldn't help but express her appreciation for his help and support, especially at a time when everything could have turned out differently. He noticed that he didn't quite understand what she was thanking him for. Everything seemed simple and natural to him, and he was genuinely surprised by her words. Then the lady remarked that she should thank him for the dance he had given her. She expressed gratitude for his attention and care, noting how pleasant it had been for her. The gentleman responded with only a modest remark that his actions were the usual duties of a gentleman. He considered it nothing special and was simply following the rules of etiquette. The girl stated that she understood that he actually wanted to protect her reputation with Lady Countess Artia. She appreciated his intentions, although she concealed her thoughts. The man smiled and said that it was not a big effort for him, because everything he did was just a small thing compared to what he would be willing to do for her. When the lady inclined her head slightly and seemed about to speak, she suddenly fell silent, deep in thought. Something important flickered in her eyes, something she had decided to bring up for discussion. She soon gained courage and asked if she could ask him for one more favor. The gentleman immediately replied that he was ready to listen to her request and awaited her answer with curiosity. She admitted that she would like him to go with her to Levgar. She was serious, expecting him to respond to her request with interest, not bewilderment. The man was a little surprised and asked what exactly she meant. He didn't know what Levgar was and couldn't understand why she wanted to visit this place, known for its unsafe reputation. The girl explained that she needed to meet a specific person at this location. She didn't reveal all the details, but his confusion seemed entirely justified in her eyes. As they drove in that direction, she decided to ask him what he thought of her proposal. She hoped he would answer, but she doubted how he would take her request. The man, after thinking for a moment, said that if she meant that he would keep their truth for 2 years, then she could fully count on his help and promises. The girl confirmed his words with surprise, her gaze filled with questions, and she looked at him with admiration, realizing that he was ready to take such serious steps for her. He stopped and said that, before giving a final answer, he needed to ask her one more important question, which she had to answer honestly and openly. He asked her why she was so insistent on breaking up after 2 years. Her motives were important to him, and he waited for her explanation, curious about her inner feelings. She did not expect such a question, but having collected her thoughts, she answered him that her decision was connected with certain circumstances that she could not ignore. The reason why she could not stay with him any longer was that Her Highness Cedric would fall in love again with Saint Lycia, whose beauty was comparable to a blooming rose. Artesia didn't want Her Highness to become the subject of rumors and accusations. She feared he would be labeled as someone who had given up on love and found a new passion. The man was surprised by her response and noted that he hadn't expected such a view of the situation. He recognized her feelings, but didn't understand how they related to her decision. The lady cautiously remarked that there was nothing to hide, but at the same time, she had no desire to become empress, realizing that her path lay in a different direction. She didn't consider herself suited to the role, though perhaps he interpreted her hesitations as moral compulsion. It was a strange feeling, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't suited to the position. The gentleman noted that she seemed to be no stranger to the desire to sacrifice herself for the good of the empire. His words were soft, but they conveyed a seriousness of intent, as if he understood the full weight of her resolve. The girl lowered her eyes, not answering him. Her silence held much unspoken. She felt the weight of this responsibility and didn't know what else to say to justify her feelings. Then the gentleman added that he had one more condition. His words were clear, yet somehow threatening, as if he were expecting something, ready to offer a solution that would change everything. He couldn't stand it when people around him suffered or experienced injustice. This character trait was well known, and now it became key to their conversation. He couldn't remain indifferent. If she decides to be near him, she must remember this rule. His voice was calm, but there was a clear confidence in it, and he wanted her to understand the full significance of her actions. The lady said she understood his words, but he noticed her answer sounded somewhat vague. He wanted her to understand that it wasn't just about harming others, but also about not harming oneself. She had to learn to prevent trouble, to prevent anything bad from happening to her or her loved ones. These words were important, and they contained concern for her well-being. The best thing, he said, was for her to stand up for herself, to fight back when the situation called for it. His words were convincing, and they made her think about how she perceived her own strengths and capabilities. He was serious, and his attitude surprised her. She hadn't expected such a frank approach from him, as his outlook on life had always seemed less insistent to her. His concern was different from what she had thought. After these words, the mistress laughed, and the gentleman felt her laughter relieve the tension. He realized she took it differently, but her laughter was light and carefree, a sign of her trust. She smiled, thanking him for his concern, and His Highness smiled back. There was sincerity in her words, and her gaze was full of gratitude, though she was still internally thinking about what she had said. After some time, they arrived at their destination. Everything was quiet, and despite the excitement, the atmosphere seemed calm. She felt that everything was happening for a reason, that their path had been predetermined. He helped her down, but suddenly picked her up. It was a gesture she hadn't expected, but his strength and confidence in the movement struck her as a genuine expression of concern. His mood, of course, was such that she couldn't help but notice the change in his actions. He noted that he hadn't stopped displaying his generosity, although to her it seemed more like an attempt to ease her path. Her heart began to beat faster as she felt his strong arms around her. The unexpected attention and the closeness made her feelings conflict, and she began to feel a thrill. Suddenly they heard voices, beggars asking for alms. Their calls were ordinary, but at this moment they seemed too intrusive, interrupting the silence and calm. The beggars ran up to them, pounced on them with requests for alms. This unexpected move was unpleasant for her, but she was already accustomed to such encounters and showed no emotion. She was prepared for things not to go as expected. These people, beggars, didn't surprise or pity her, and she remained cold and indifferent to what was happening. Everyone begged, but the lady stood silently and didn't react. Her silence was like a barrier between her and the world around her. She couldn't allow herself to be immersed in it. When a maid brought her a cloak to cover her and change her appearance, the mistress accepted it without a word. It was simply a gesture necessary to conceal herself and avoid attracting attention. The gentleman assumed she always prepared such clothes for herself in advance, as her appearance was always meticulously planned. However, he couldn't help but notice that she hadn't planned to come here. The lady noted that her hair attracted attention. It was obvious, as her light locks immediately caught everyone's attention, creating a certain sense of uniqueness and enhancing her appearance. As they approached the carriage, the coachman began to push them away with hostility. His actions clearly expressed a desire to leave them alone, and he tried to push them away as if they were unwanted guests. The Duke, noticing this, looked at the coachman, who, in turn, stared at him like angry dogs. Their displeasure was palpable, and he clearly sensed their hostility. The gentleman made it clear that it was time to move on. His voice was decisive, and his words left no doubt. It was time to continue on, despite all the obstacles. Along the way, Cedric, unable to bear the silence, inquired who the girl was planning to meet. The question was innocent, but his interest was genuine, and he awaited the answer with curiosity. The girl replied that she had an appointment with the butler, which greatly surprised him. This confession took him by surprise, as he hadn't expected the meeting with this man to be so important. The lady couldn't help but notice that Cedric's ancestors had served in Roseanne's family for many generations. However, after the Marquis's death, he was dismissed, and now such relationships were a thing of the past. She also added that she now had absolutely no one to trust. This feeling of loneliness was difficult for her, and she couldn't find support among those around her. Cedric lingered resentment toward both her mother and herself. But his family had always been tied to the service of the Marquis of Roseanne, and for generations his ancestors had carried out their work with loyalty and honor. Batman, confident in the power of the blood he inherited, decided he had to visit this man. He believed his origins could play a significant role in what was happening. The Roseanne family's butler was a member of the ancient aristocracy, and his family was distinguished by its wealth and strong traditions. His place in society was undisputed, but life had changed. But now this butler found himself in such a terrible place that it was impossible not to feel compassion. His situation looked tragic, and everything pointed to his downfall. After some time, they reached his home and even entered the institute itself. The place was familiar to him, but now it felt so alien that he felt something entirely new. Seeing strangers before him, he felt afraid. The fear of not knowing who they were and what they wanted overwhelmed him, but he tried to hide his emotions and not show weakness. He said he was curious about what had brought these distinguished guests to his home. His words were filled with genuine curiosity, and his eyes searched for answers to the questions that tormented him. The girl asked if she could spare Mr. Hanson a little time to talk. She wasn't sure how he would react, but she hoped he would understand. The gentleman was surprised to hear this request. He said he'd be back soon and might be able to help, but his time was limited. His words sounded a little hesitant. The place they found themselves in wasn't his home. In fact, it was some bar where he worked as a cleaner. It was clearly a place out of keeping with his status and surroundings. He tried to reassure the girl, saying they were unlikely to kill him, so there was no need to worry. All they needed was a little time to sort things out. When they got outside, he admitted that maybe this wasn't the best option. Getting them somewhere clean was quite difficult, especially if you were a laborer. Despite all the difficulties, he couldn't understand why Duke Ephron had come to him. It was all too strange, and he couldn't find an explanation for it. Despite his expulsion, the Hanson family had cared for Roseanne's lineage for generations. He couldn't divulge any of their family secrets despite their difficulties. The gentleman said he was merely a bodyguard for the lady, and that no special privileges or information should be expected from him. He was doing his job, nothing more. He looked closely at the girl, who at that moment removed her hood. Everything suddenly became clear, and his gaze was full of surprise when he recognized her. At that moment, he recognized that hair, and immediately realized that standing before him was none other than Madame Roseanne. Remembering her face, he couldn't help but feel a certain uneasiness. She was rather cold in her manner, but she still greeted him, giving him her name. His wariness only increased because she clearly knew more about him than he realized. He suddenly realized who she really was. She was the daughter of Melera, the woman who had brought about the destruction of Roseanne's family. This revelation left him bewildered. He said she bore a striking resemblance to Mr. Mihail, but his words were laced with irritation and anger that were impossible to hide. The lady noticed that he was the first to address her as a young marquise, which couldn't help but surprise her. She was accustomed to being treated differently, and his words left a strange impression. The man asked if her mother knew she was there, and the girl replied that if her mother had known, she would never have allowed her to come. She felt the decision was her own. His face was full of anger as he asked the young lady if she knew what her mother had done to cause this to happen. His question sounded like an accusation, full of indignation and resentment. Artesia looked down, realizing the gravity of the situation. She replied that she was perfectly aware of what had happened, a clear admission of her role in the events they had discussed. She added that her mother had poisoned all the direct heirs of the Marquis of Roseanne, and this was her cruel move to eliminate everyone who could claim the title and inheritance so that Artesia would become the sole heir. The girl continued that her mother had accused the Hansen family of this crime, and thus her plan was concealed behind lies and manipulation. It was a game in which Artesia was a pawn. She explained that her mother had done all this so that Artesia could become the sole heir of the Marquis of Roseanne. Her words carried the weight of the realization that her life had been part of a vast political conspiracy. When the Duke heard these words, he was stunned. His face expressed complete surprise and shock. He couldn't believe such events could have taken place in their world, and it left a deep mark on his soul. Remembering his daughter's words, the butler grew even more angry. He recalled her telling her father that if they didn't take the necessary measures, they would all be killed. That remained etched in his memory forever. But he didn't agree with this. He had evidence against the Marquise, and he believed that this evidence could prove decisive, despite her cunning and manipulation. However, his daughter said that even if he succeeded in proving Milera's guilt, they would still be in mortal danger. It was a difficult admission, but she was convinced he was right. She added that no one would protect them because the Marquis of Roseanne's relatives wouldn't interfere. She didn't believe they could count on help, since everyone was involved in this murky affair. The daughter explained that all of the Marquis' relatives were blinded by greed and the desire to obtain their share of the inheritance, which significantly limited their ability to act honestly and openly. My father, however, was firm in his opinion, believing that despite all the difficulties, he shouldn't pretend he didn't understand what was happening. He was ready to fight, openly admitting his awareness of what was happening around him. The killer's identity was obvious. But despite this, everyone knew the truth remained hidden. The future hung in the balance, and the consequences were unclear. Only she, the heiress, could decide what to do next. The father, understanding the gravity of the situation, was certain that revealing the truth would only cause harm. He thought his daughter wouldn't appreciate his honesty or be grateful for his candor. What was important was that his actions would inevitably lead to conflict with Artesia's mother. She could perceive this as a threat and become his enemy, and that was a risk he didn't know how to handle. His daughter expressed her point of view. He needed to understand what this would lead to, otherwise there would be problems. But he couldn't hide his confusion and asked her to gather everyone together to resolve the issue. In response to her request, he suggested that from now on, they conceal their real names. It wasn't easy, but he believed there was no other way. They had to forget everything connected with their work and life under the Roseanne Marquises. It was the only way to protect themselves and maintain any chance of survival. He told his family about it, expecting everyone to understand the significance of his words. However, despite the warnings, he himself was unable to act as he advised his husband. This decision left him deeply affected. But even so, despite his desire to maintain the status quo, he couldn't resist. He knew the future was too uncertain, and those around him couldn't escape fear and doubt. Roth Hansen remained true to his principles. He was proud of his name despite all the trials and tribulations. Still, he knew that one day the Marquise would discover him. And then, when his life already seemed doomed, he increasingly thought that even if the Marquise had ever found him, he would not have escaped his fate. It was inevitable, despite his efforts. Then the butler, having made his decision, took an unexpected step. He asked the young woman why she was looking for him in the first place. This was important to him, as the question remained unanswered. Artesia, without missing a beat, said that before answering, she owed him a sincere apology. She understood how important it was to him and was willing to admit her mistakes. The man was extremely surprised by this answer. He hadn't expected to hear such words and didn't even know how to respond. It was an unexpected reaction, and it took him a while to understand its motives. The girl announced that she was not her mother's daughter, and these words sounded quite unexpected. What she said stirred a lot of emotions in those who listened to her. She clarified that she belonged to the last descendant of the Rozan family because her ancestors were unable to protect their subjects, which turned out to be a heavy blow for her interlocutor. He was in complete shock when the young Marquise uttered these words, unable to believe his ears. What she said was beyond his comprehension. She expressed sincere regret about what happened, emphasizing that she absolutely did not want everything to turn out exactly the way it did, which did not make the situation any easier. The gentleman, slightly embarrassed, suppressed a smile at her words. He was clearly confused, but the sincerity of her words nevertheless reassured him a little. He couldn't hold back a tear, and the Duke, standing next to him, smiled at the sight. It was a difficult moment, but the emotion it evoked was genuine. At this point, Artesia's mother, Melera, became enraged. She literally raged, throwing objects around, unable to contain her emotions at what was happening. She demanded that the butler repeat what he had said. The butler, slightly taken aback, replied that His Highness, Archduke Ephron, had inquired as to why he was devoted to Mrs. Artesia. Hearing these words, the woman exploded with rage. She couldn't contain her anger. Her irritation grew, and every moment seemed more and more painful. She couldn't understand who this man was who dared to speak such nonsense. There was no room for doubt in her eyes. It was all absurd and unbearable. The butler noted that the Duke had said that since Miss Artesia was now the rightful mistress of the estate, he should inform her of everything that had happened, and that she was now aware of the events. Melera was literally furious when she heard someone claim her daughter was the rightful mistress, and how the butler simply stood there, listening. She couldn't believe such words. He noted that it was His Highness, the Archduke himself, and that no one could dare contradict him or say anything against him. After all, he could deal with him without the slightest consequences. The woman was furious, unsure how to react to what had happened. She couldn't understand how this could have happened, or what she should do about it. She asked for water, and the butler immediately headed toward her, only managing to say that he would bring it. He hurried, trying to fulfill her request as quickly as possible. Melera sat down, lost in thought, wondering why she felt so strange and curious about where this girl could have met the Archduke. She wanted to figure it out, feeling a slight sense of unease. Artesia's appearance was largely modest and could not compare to her mother's splendor. She lacked the charm and femininity that so vividly displayed Melira. She couldn't understand what kind of trick Artesia was playing on, why she was behaving this way. This only added to the complexity of her own perception of the situation. Archduke Ephron was a mystery to her. Melera began to wonder why he was showing such attention to her daughter. What motivated him to court her and behave in such a way? Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and the butler hurried to open it, not expecting what would happen next. He was ready to meet whoever was determined to interrupt his thoughts and sort out the situation. He turned to the servant and asked what had happened, that he had come so unexpectedly and without warning. The servant was a little confused and didn't know what to say, but he soon pulled himself together and spoke. The servant reported that the retinue of His Highness Archduke Ephron had arrived, which meant something important was about to happen. This announcement immediately attracted the master's attention. The servant added that the Archduke had boarded the carriage and Mrs. Artesia was with him. This raised even more questions, as no one expected such a visit and such an entourage. Artesia and the Archduke. The servant continued that they were heading towards Count Endar's estate, which added even more tension. It was unclear what this meeting was and how it would impact events. The owner of the estate, without hesitation, ordered them to remain there and await their return, not to leave or do anything until they returned to Rozan's estate. Everything became more mysterious. The woman, upon learning that the Archduke's entourage was present, was shocked. She clearly hadn't expected such a visit and couldn't comprehend what it all meant for her and for everyone. Looking at the butler and servant, she gave them a reproachful glance, expressing dissatisfaction with what was happening. A hint of confusion and perhaps hidden anxiety could be seen in her eyes. At that moment, young Master Lawrence entered the room and the butler was completely surprised by his appearance. Nearance, as always, was composed and immediately attracted attention with his appearance. Lawrence bowed, openly curious, and asked what was going on. He was clearly interested in whether the butler had enjoyed his walk, as he sensed something unusual about it. Lawrence explained that Archduke Ephron's escort was outside and he was deeply intrigued. He wanted to understand what exactly had brought them here and how it related to his surroundings. The butler, wasting no time, announced that everything would soon become clear and that he was ready to provide all the details. He was prepared to explain what had happened, whatever it was, because the situation demanded an explanation. Mother approached Lawrence with a warm smile, welcoming him home. Her words were softly concerned, but her eyes betrayed her wariness. She had noticed his presence and decided to pay attention. Lawrence bowed his head, considering the possible reasons for such a visit. He assumed his mother was having problems with Duke Ephron, as their relationship had always been strained. However, he didn't know the details. However, the woman dismissed these thoughts, insisting she had no problems with the Duke. She didn't understand what kind of difficulties could arise between them, considering their relationship perfectly normal. At that moment, she noticed Lawrence standing silently, frowning. Her keen observation couldn't help but notice that his gaze was heavy and thoughtful. He was clearly troubled by something, which caught her attention. She couldn't help but notice his sullen expression and, moving closer, looked at him closely. She sensed that something was troubling him, and this made her even more concerned about her son's well-being. His mother, noticing his irritation, inquired about what was wrong. She asked him what was upsetting him so much, since his appearance clearly indicated some inner turmoil he was hesitant to express. Lawrence, openly concerned, asked her if she had done anything that might offend Archduke Ephron. He couldn't understand the source of this displeasure, or whether his mother had unwittingly caused the conflict. The woman, mildly surprised, replied that she hadn't seen Ephron for the last time. He'd left as soon as he'd learned Artesia was gone and seemed uninterested in what followed. Lawrence, frowning, said he understood now and suggested she stay out of the situation. If Ephron returned, she should remain calm and leave things as they were until he sorted things out. His mother couldn't understand why Lawrence had made such a decision. He was clearly hiding something, and she found it difficult to understand why he was so insistent that she stay out of it. Lawrence expressed the opinion that Archduke Ephron always kept his word, and for Artesia, this was an unexpected confirmation of her usefulness. However, if someone like her mother intervened, it would only complicate the situation. The woman didn't immediately grasp the meaning of his words, couldn't understand why Lawrence had mentioned that the intervention of someone like her could be a hindrance. She didn't understand what that meant. Lawrence assumed her question was prompted by ignorance of the situation. He was sure she was unaware of the Archduke's contempt for her. It was a well-known fact. Unfortunately, as Lawrence explained, because of this relationship with her mother, her father was unable to give him a more important role, other than as a prince, which was disappointing but inevitable. The woman was completely shocked by what she heard. She couldn't figure out how to react to Lawrence's words. It was too unexpected and incomprehensible for her. Meanwhile, Artesia stood before the butler, waiting for him to respond. She was focused and prepared for conversation, but she didn't expect the conversation to take such a turn. Artesia announced that she would soon be getting married and taking over Roseanne's estate from her mother. She stated that the decision had already been made and the estate would be hers. The girl emphasized that she would need the butler's assistance in this process. She intended to organize the proper seizure of all Roseanne's family property, ensuring that everything was done legally. Artesia reminded him that the butler knew almost everything about the property and its previous staff, and he was up to date on every detail, something the man himself confirmed. He didn't dispute it. She said that first, he needed to return to his rightful place and help her with this undertaking. This step was the first step toward resolving all issues related to the estate and its fate. He noticed that his family saw this as only a shadow of sin and accused him of poisoning. However, he couldn't understand how he could return to their circle once their trust had already been lost. He said he couldn't figure out how to return to the world from which he had been exiled. It seemed impossible, especially given how the situation had worsened. His entire life now seemed like an eclipse. Artesia decided to approach the butler, offering a solution to the situation. She announced her willingness to become the Marchioness of Roseanne, take responsibility for everything that had happened, and resolve all the issues that had arisen. She was determined to overcome the other challenges that came her way. Artesia was certain that there was a solution to every situation, and she would find a way to overcome all difficulties. Ultimately, the man agreed with her plan. He realized she was determined enough and ready to take control. Although he had doubts, he promised to follow her lead and trust her judgment. Soon they were riding in the carriage again, heading home. The atmosphere in the carriage was somewhat tense, but everyone understood that a difficult journey lay ahead, full of trials that they would have to endure together. The Duke, noticing her determination, praised the girl. He said he admired her ability to make such difficult decisions at such a young age. His words were full of respect and admiration. Artesia, a little surprised, asked him what exactly he was talking about, as she hadn't expected to hear such an assessment from him. She hadn't thought her actions could make such an impression on such an experienced man. The gentleman, in reply, remarked that the best way to change someone's mind is through actions, not words. He was confident that Artesia understood this principle perfectly well and was already successfully using it. He added that for her age, this is really impressive, and she seems to have learned to achieve goals in this way for a long time. The girl replied that she wasn't trying to impress Mr. Butler. She simply offered him a suitable option that would suit both of them. Mr. Butler was suffering from life's difficulties and was currently struggling to cope with the responsibilities of caring for his 14-year-old granddaughter, which did not make his situation any easier. He had been considering leaving the bar for a long time, feeling that his time there was over, but he said he wouldn't have taken such a step without a good reason. He admitted that it was only thanks to the girl's proposal that he could take this step, because her approach turned out to be exactly what he needed at that moment. Suddenly, the gentleman noticed the Archduke laughing and, intrigued, asked him to repeat the question. He was slightly surprised by this reaction, as everything had been quite serious, and his question seemed entirely appropriate. Then the butler, noticing her confusion, added that she probably considered herself a villain. This moment revealed a certain depth in her internal perception of what was happening, and it became clear that she understood the consequences. The woman lowered her head slightly as if losing confidence and admitted that this was indeed the case. She spoke without any forced arrogance, as if she were reeling from a mistake she couldn't correct. "A person who knows the truth always strives to avoid shame," she continued, realizing that hiding the truth would be impossible. Her words echoed pain for her own actions and reflections on honor. She understood that only a person can decide his own destiny and correct mistakes. But she was unable to justify the butler's actions, although she remembered the truth, which greatly tormented her soul. So he would return and serve her, despite everything that had happened. His words were striking, and their simplicity concealed both the strength and the responsibility with which he intended to continue his service. The girl was a little surprised by the Duke's words and asked him again, not quite understanding what he meant. His confidence and willingness to explain began to raise more and more questions in her mind. He responded by noting that it was clear to the man that he sincerely loved Roseanne's family, and that she, in turn, was their last descendant, which also could not help but leave a mark on her perception of what was happening. After a few minutes of conversation and reflection, the coachman announced that they had arrived. This was a momentous occasion, and his words became the signal to continue on to the next stage of their journey. The Duke carefully helped the lady out of the carriage, showing his respect and concern for her well-being. Everything was done with the nobility characteristic of his status and upbringing. The butler immediately ran up to the Duke, out of breath from his haste, and greeted him respectfully. He was completely focused on his duty and couldn't afford to waste a moment for politeness. He inquired about the lady's arrival, carefully noting every detail. Then, bowing, he gave her a respectful nod, emphasizing the importance of this visit. The butler also addressed His Highness, noting that Mr. Lawrence had said he would definitely invite him to dinner. These words sounded informal, but they already had a sufficiently formal tone. The Archduke said that this time he would still refuse, but promised that next time he would definitely agree to her request if circumstances turned out differently. However, he added that if the lady herself had invited him, the situation would have taken a completely different turn, and he would without a doubt have agreed without hesitation. The girl immediately noted that, being an unmarried lady, she had no right to invite a man at such a late hour, especially if he was not her relative. Then the gentleman, with a slight smile, remarked that he had known from the very beginning that she would answer exactly like that, since her upbringing and position in society obliged her to do so. In response, the girl hastened to assure him that, of course, she forgave him for his persistence, and asked him to be careful on the way back, because the night was treacherous. The Archduke slowly mounted his horse, adjusted the reins, and set off, directing his steed away from the castle, where strange feelings had led him today. But before he had time to go far, the lady called out to him, asking him to stop for a moment, as if she had not had time to say something important. The girl, a little embarrassed, asked if she could ask him another question that had been bothering her for a long time, but she hadn't dared to ask before. The gentleman turned around and allowed her to speak, his long hair fluttering beautifully in the wind, creating an almost fairy tale-like effect in the moonlight. She cautiously asked why he was speaking to her so respectfully, since he had previously allowed himself to be much less reserved. The girl reminded her that during their last meeting he treated her differently, but now he only smiled silently, as if he was hiding something behind that smile. The Archduke replied briefly that, as Malera's daughter, she had given him no particular reason to show courtesy, and he had not considered it necessary before. But now, he continued, Respect was a duty owed to the girl who was destined to become his wife and future mistress. Without giving the girl a chance to say a word in response, he abruptly turned his horse and quickly rode away, leaving her alone with the sudden surge of feelings. The lady was standing in the yard, looking thoughtfully at the clear blue sky, when a maid rushed towards her from afar at full speed, obviously excited about something important and hurrying to tell her the news. The girl was approaching so quickly that the lady, noticing her, turned around and with slight surprise in her voice asked what had happened and why she had run so quickly, not hiding her excitement. Barely having caught her breath, the maid hastened to explain that young Master Lawrence wished to see his mistress immediately, as if the matter he wished to discuss could not tolerate delay for a moment. At this time, Lawrence himself stood at the window on the second floor and watched them attentively, and the lady, catching his gaze, immediately realized that they were really urgently waiting for her. She wasted no time in going to the door where her brother was and knocking to announce her arrival. Then entering, she gently asked what exactly had happened. Upon entering, she also noticed that he himself had recently been looking for her, and then Lawrence, as if confirming her guess, said that he had learned of her recent meeting with Archduke Ephron. The girl calmly explained that she had indeed met the Archduke by chance at Count Endar's estate, where they had briefly strolled through the garden, engaging in ordinary small talk. Lawrence, clearly interested, asked if they were planning to meet again, and Artesia thoughtfully asked if such meetings were really no longer considered unacceptable. To this, the brother, with a slight smile, reminded that such meetings were entirely acceptable, since Artesia had turned 18 and had the right to decide for herself with whom to spend time. Lawrence added that next time she should invite the Archduke to her house, since he himself had not yet had the opportunity to make his acquaintance due to Ephron's rare appearances in society. They were in complete shock when they suddenly heard a strange noise outside the door. Something was rumbling and there were sharp sounds, as if someone had dropped something or started a fight, and this disturbed their peace. Screams could be heard there, quite loud and harsh. Lawrence, trying to dismiss them, noted that it was just another hysterical outburst, something that had happened before and wasn't worth their attention. He said it was best not to interfere, as if the Archduke saw her injuries, it would be awkward. There was a chance they would all come under suspicion, and the situation would only worsen. Artesia silently agreed, but still couldn't understand why the screams sounded so angry. She was plagued by doubts, because even for hysteria, this seemed too violent a scene. She'd previously tried to persuade her mother to calm down at such moments, believing that a peaceful conversation would help. But it was no use. The screaming didn't stop. It only grew louder. The mother would then snap at her, rudely reminding her that the girl could not be contradicted, that she was too impudent and in general should know her place, not daring to contradict her elders. Then her body would be covered in bruises and it seemed the pain would never end. Her mother regularly took out her anger on her, not even bothering to hide the marks of the beatings. The maid standing nearby was surprised that her mistress didn't even try to enter. Apparently, she believed that interfering in other people's affairs wasn't her job. Quickly and quietly, she suggested that perhaps it would be better if she tried to replace her to prevent the worst from happening. The maid explained that this was not what she had meant at all, but Artesia insisted that she take her out of there before things got any worse and before something could be done. However, the maid said in fear that if she dared to do this, the consequences would be terrible for everyone, because breaking the order was strictly punished. But Artesia firmly replied that if they all shared the punishment, the beatings would not be so terrible, and for their bravery, she was ready to generously compensate them for the treatment. After that incident, the girl began to reach out to her everywhere, as if finding Artesia her only refuge, and every time they met, warm gratitude shone in her eyes. Artesia then recalled how her mother would brew lemon tea for her, hoping to fool everyone. She thought that if her daughter grew her hair, no one would notice the bruises. The girl replied that not everything was as it seemed, explaining that her brother had recently invited her for a talk. They chatted briefly, and she assured him that she would never disobey her mother. Mom hugged Artesia tenderly and said with a kind smile that it was the right thing to do. After all, when she grew old, she would have no one to rely on but her own daughter, who would always be there. She then remarked that she owed her life to Artesia. The girl then cautiously asked if her mother was truly in a bad mood, trying to figure out how to cheer her up a little. She suggested that her mother accompany His Majesty the Emperor, since they didn't have to visit the palace. Artesia thought it might distract her a little. The weather had been unbearably hot for the past few days. They wanted to confine the Emperor, at least temporarily, for the sake of Amaranth, since the sea was so close by that it would have been much cooler. It would be a good idea to escape the heat. Artesia thought that perhaps Lawrence would have some free time to join them on the shore. If her brother was too busy with business, Artesia suggested they go with the emperor. She believed her mother wouldn't mind if the trip lifted her spirits. The mother agreed. She smiled softly, as if warmed by her daughter's concern, and slowly sipped a cup of aromatic tea, savoring this brief respite. Meanwhile, the emperor was heavily burdened with the care of the Western army, commanded by Archduke Ephron. These concerns weighed heavily on his shoulders. So when Melira invited him to get away from business for a while and escape the sweltering heat for at least a few weeks, he decided it was an excellent excuse to put his pressing issues aside. The emperor and his mistress went on a summer vacation, leaving everyone else at the castle. It was their way to escape the noise and worries of the palace, to enjoy the solitude and summer days away from business. For Artesia, this situation was a wonderful opportunity to focus on herself. She had long needed rest and could afford to not think about family matters and imperial duties. A few days later, the butler began noticing strange things. In one of the corridors, he saw numerous boxes and materials he couldn't figure out where they came from or why they were brought to the castle. At that moment, a red-haired girl entered the room and immediately greeted the butler with a smile. It was Emily, the well-known owner of a renowned costume shop. She immediately caught his attention with her charisma. The butler couldn't help but notice that they hadn't ordered any new outfits, and the boxes he saw seemed out of place. He became wary and tried to figure out what these materials were and where they came from. Moreover, the butler noted with surprise that Mrs. Artesia was currently absent. She had gone to the summer palace with the cameraman and was nowhere to be found in the castle. This only added to the strangeness of the situation. However, Emily smiled calmly and assured him that everything was not as he thought. She had not come to pick up an order for the mistress as he might have assumed. Her words were gentle and her confidence calmed the butler somewhat. Emily clarified that she hadn't actually come to work with Mrs. Artesia, but with Mrs. Artesia. The butler was stunned. He hadn't expected the conversation to be about Mrs. Artesia, as he hadn't known about her. He couldn't believe his ears when she said those words. All he knew was Artesia as the heir, and now here was this other woman he knew nothing about. The girl noted that the Archduke himself had sent her, and that he had given her complete freedom of action. He had allowed her to create as much as she pleased, without any restrictions, which made her task considerably easier. The butler knew that if his mistress saw the mess when she returned, he'd be severely reprimanded again. He tried to tidy everything up, knowing her displeasure would be considerable. He apologized and said that today was not the time for apologies or justifications. He had not received the mistress's permission to do so, so he could not act on his own, despite the current situation. At that moment, he noticed a knight standing nearby. The butler was a little confused and unsure how to respond, as the situation seemed unclear to him, and the knight looked expectant. Afterwards, they greeted the Marchioness Rossana with restraint, trying not to show any undue nervousness. Politeness and restraint were necessary in such a situation, so as not to spoil the atmosphere. The lady emerged and, without wasting any time, greeted the knight, as well as Emily, who was standing nearby. They exchanged polite words, and she immediately demonstrated her respect for their presence. The lady remarked that she did not remember inviting these people to her place, and a suspicion immediately arose in her mind that there was some purpose or important matter in this that required their presence. She mentioned that she had just returned and that Duke Ephron himself had sent her. He had commissioned an entire wardrobe for her, which was important given the upcoming events, and she was willing to share the details. Upon hearing the Archduke's name, she was in complete shock. This news shook her deeply, as she hadn't expected such a reaction or such a turn of events. Everything that was happening seemed too unexpected. The mistress added that Sophia was to escort Madame to the boudoir. This was an important assignment, and she knew Sophia would fulfill her role with due consideration and respect for her mistress. The maid readily accompanied her mistress, and the two looked very charming together. The atmosphere was calm and joyful, and everyone around them couldn't help but notice their harmony and good mood. At that moment, she noticed another gentleman standing nearby. He immediately bowed, demonstrating his courtesy and respect for her presence, which couldn't help but leave an impression. He introduced himself, saying he was the knight Alphonse de Rouen. He explained that he had come by order of His Majesty the Duke to provide the necessary protection to the Marquis at this important moment. He added that his mission was to protect the Marquis, and despite the formality of the situation, he seemed quite confident in his words. His presence underscored the importance of the events unfolding. She also noted that if she continued to fulfill her role as His Majesty's sword, she would become the Legion's shield. It was a long process that required her determination and dedication to her duties. The lady expressed her understanding and asked the butler to be more courteous and escort the lord to a room located down the corridor from her own. This was an important instruction. The butler was extremely surprised and shocked by this order. He said that he certainly could not occupy the new room without the permission of the mistress and young master. It was against the rules. The Marquise, without showing any emotion, coldly stated that he was obliged to obey her and fulfill her demands. There was no room for doubt, and her word was final on this matter. She asked him again if it was worth reminding him again who she was and what position she occupied. It was said with such emphasis that the butler could not dispute her authority. Then one of the servants approached her and advised her that it would be best to avoid such threats. He suggested discussing the situation in a calmer atmosphere to avoid unnecessary tension. He noted that the problem concerned the entire family, but the knight, without letting him finish, grabbed him by the shoulders and forced him to his knees. It was a harsh reminder of the power in this house. Artesia said bitterly that the butler had failed again. Incompetent people like him disgraced the Marquis' family name in the eyes of His Majesty the Archduke. This could not go without consequences. One mistake isn't the end of the world. It could have been forgiven if he'd just been a little lazy. The owner might not have noticed that his labor wasn't bearing fruit and wouldn't have bothered to pay attention. But if this happens twice, if he makes fun of her again, then Lord Alphonse and the Archduke will see her in this light, and her name will be ruined in the eyes of those on whom her future depends. Artesia asked to be reminded of who she was, but her gaze was weary, as if her existence was being questioned again and she needed to prove her place. She didn't like unnecessary questions. The butler was absolutely horrified. This girl was usually quite gentle and calm, but today something in her behavior was clearly off. He sensed that something bad was about to happen, and there was no way to fool him. He realized that if the lady found out about this, he would be in trouble. He only hoped she wouldn't make it public, as the consequences could be too serious for everyone. The maid's response was anger. She didn't believe there would be any punishment, even if her mistress found out. On the contrary, she hoped this situation would end as quickly as it began. At that moment, the Marquise turned to him again, asking who she was. But her tone was decisive, almost unperturbed. She was expecting a precise answer, and there was no time to think. He quickly but quietly said that she was a young marquise. His answer was reserved, laced with anxiety. He didn't want to get into trouble, but he knew he couldn't hide the truth. Then the lady, turning to him, said in a restrained tone that if he understood what was happening, he would need to prepare something for Lord Alphonse and organize a room for his escort. She also added that once he'd completed all the errands, he'd need to bring her the keys to the vault and the trade ledger. The man was shocked by her calm and asked again which keys she was referring to. Artesia replied that if he didn't understand her demands again, he'd be in serious trouble. There wasn't a hint of doubt in her voice, only a cold confidence that she was in control. She clarified that she was talking about the keys to the vault. After she spoke, they left, and the butler, out of habit, bowed his head, trying to remain calm despite this whole ambiguity. Every day he gave Miss no peace, constantly tormenting her, which irritated her to the extreme. Finally, the maid could bear it no longer and in a rage struck him, showing her determination. The Marquise, upon learning of what had happened, immediately apologized, even though the prescription had only recently been delivered and she had already witnessed the unpleasant scene. It all unfolded before her very eyes, which greatly disturbed her. However, the knight observing the situation noted that, in essence, there was nothing wrong with it. He emphasized that the Duke had always said that a lady's position in the family was a very complex and ambiguous one. He added that even if he didn't understand the lady's actions, he wouldn't doubt her motives. All her actions, in his opinion, had a logical explanation, and they always had their reasons. And even Lawrence, the one who had always been devoted to her, didn't trust her completely. Despite the closeness of their relationship, a shadow of doubt still remained, and this was what upset her most. The military dispatch from His Highness was a sign of trust, demonstrating that she had his support. This gesture seemed intended to help her strengthen her position and reach a new level. Now, with this step, she could move on. She realized that this was her chance to change her destiny and take an important step in life. Despite the difficulties she had to overcome, the Duke stood at the entrance to the jewelry workshop and said they should visit Mr. White. His words rang with confidence, as if it were something necessary and crucial to their future actions. His servant asked if he had found the stone he planned to use to propose to Malera's daughter. It was a moment when seemingly unimportant questions became crucial to the future. The young man also asked the Duke if it was true that he really intended to marry the Marquise's daughter. The Duke, wasting no time, replied that he had already made that decision and all that remained was to act according to plan. The knight didn't hide his indignation. He couldn't understand how His Highness, knowing who Malera was, could react so calmly to the proposal, especially since giving a precious stone, a symbol of a broken family, was highly inappropriate. The servant, seeing his doubts, remarked that if he didn't trust his abilities and insight, it would be best to abandon this step. However, the knight was confident that his opinion was important and did not give in. They mounted their horses and immediately set out on their journey. Their intention was clear, and although the journey was long, their determination did not weaken. They strove for their goal, despite all the difficulties. He suddenly remembered something she'd asked him to do when he proposed. It was a profound promise she'd left in his memory, one he couldn't forget. He was stunned by her request and immediately asked again, unable to believe his ears. This was something unexpected, demanding an explanation. He couldn't understand what exactly lay behind her words. The lady confirmed her words, saying that she truly needed Olga's heart. It was something important and mysterious, demanding attention and an understanding of the depth of her intentions. He didn't know why she had done this. Why was this request for the family heirloom so important to her? She was his confidant, and he had decided to trust her, despite all his doubts. It seemed the mourning period had now begun. The servant noticed his master's distress, but he still understood that they had to continue on their way. The time for a visit might not come soon, but they had to move on. The gentleman confirmed the information was correct, but his expression betrayed a slight displeasure, as if something about the matter didn't quite suit him. Apparently, he'd expected more. He knocked on the door, raising his eyebrows slightly, and politely inquired if anyone was inside. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of wariness in it. The door opened, and the girl, barely glancing at them, asked with mild surprise how she could help such grateful gentlemen as they. Her voice was soft, her gaze genuinely interested. The servant, standing with his head held high, announced that they had come on recommendation and handed the girl a letter of introduction. He handed it over respectfully, making it clear that they were all acting on orders from their superiors. The girl took the letter and, glancing at it, realized that it was His Highness Archduke Ephron standing before her. Concern flashed in her eyes, but she tried to remain calm. She released him with restraint, bowing her head slightly, and apologized regretfully, explaining that they hadn't meant to disturb them at such a difficult time. Her words sounded sincere, but it was clear she was uneasy. However, the girl quickly calmed down and added that there was really nothing to worry about. The letter of introduction, written by her uncle Odorov, stated that His Highness was looking for a precious stone. She said she actually confirmed her uncle's words, as he claimed her father had ownership of the stone. Unfortunately, her father had recently passed away, and the jewelry store's trade ledger remained intact. She promised to find it and help. She excitedly asked what stone they were looking for and eagerly awaited the answer. The gentleman, with a serious expression, announced that it was the heart of Saint Olga, without betraying any unnecessary emotion. Hearing this name, the girl froze and her hand trembled. Fear crossed her face, and her eyes filled with anxiety. Her entire demeanor betrayed her inner tension and anxiety. Artesia was shaking with excitement. The knight, noticing her distress, decided to help and took the mug of tea from her hands. He thought she had already sold the tea to someone, but his suspicions were not entirely correct. The girl, swallowing back tears, explained that it wasn't just tea, but a contract that transferred ownership of St. Olga's heart. She looked closely at the knight, trying to gauge his reaction. She added that this contract had been concluded 7 years earlier, when the knight had purchased the promissory note. She tried to show that her actions were not accidental, that she was not to blame for what had happened. However, despite his explanations, the knight continued to delay payment and failed to fulfill his obligations. This happened day after day, and it became increasingly difficult for the girl to remain calm in this situation. A closer look at the contract revealed that ownership would only be transferred after all payments had been made. The woman knew she could sue and win, but she didn't know how to proceed. She noted that if a lawsuit had been possible, they would have done so long ago. But because the diamond had been given to the Marchioness Camilla, they had no other options, and they found themselves in a difficult situation. It was Marchioness Camilla and her disciple, Archduchess Roygor. The girl remembered her, knowing the great age difference between the two women and how it affected their relationship. Archduchess Roygor obeyed Marquise Camilla as if she were her own mother due to the vast age difference and the respect she felt for her. This greatly influenced her behavior and decisions. Moreover, Marquise Camilla was Archduke Roygor's most trusted supporter. The girl, unable to bear it, began to cry, and her servant quietly remarked that the situation was truly very difficult and hopeless. Artesia's father invested almost his entire fortune in Olga's heart, hoping for her affections. But after one unfortunate incident, he suffered ruin and went bankrupt. Broken by this, he died soon after. At one point, they took her father's life, and the Archduke, meanwhile, declared that he would take away this important document, which was supposed to be decisive in the current situation. The girl, however, did not agree with this decision. For her, it was still just a piece of paper, which could not compensate for the losses suffered by her family and personal grief. They didn't burn the document, even though Artesia's father couldn't forget his past mistake. But the gentleman in turn declared that she had acted for her father's well-being, and that was important. Despite his father's words, he needed this document, and he was confident he would find a way to use it properly. Everything that was happening had special significance for him, and he knew how to proceed. That evening, the servant noticed something curious, but the master didn't understand what it was. He simply couldn't grasp the essence of his observations, and so he showed no interest. At first, the servant assumed that Lady Marquise Rosa might simply ask him for an expensive engagement gift, as often happens. But for him, this wasn't as important as it seemed at first glance. No one could have imagined that Archduke Rhaegar would be involved in this matter. He was not only one of the most influential men in the empire, with a claim to the throne, but also the uncle of the future emperor. It was indeed so. The servant, finding himself in a difficult situation, didn't know what to do. The young Amortise Rosa had just caused a quarrel with Madame de la Marquise Camelia, thereby worsening the situation. If he decides to file a lawsuit over the precious diamond, it could completely destroy the Marchioness of Camelia's reputation. Such a move would not only undermine her image, but also lead to grave consequences. An honest merchant was robbed of a precious stone, leading to bankruptcy and then death. This left his children without parents, and now they are orphans, a tragedy for the entire family. This is sure to cause quite a scandal, especially considering that His Highness is currently searching for the perfect gift to propose to. The whole situation could seriously affect his choice. The Duke categorically declared that he had no intention of divulging the honor of the Marchioness of Camelia, much less airing the White family affairs in public. He was certain it would be of no avail. The gentleman couldn't understand the point of fighting this conflict if the outcome of this military move could only ruin the reputations of the well-bred ladies. He saw only the consequences for their image in this matter. He also noted that the entire situation resembled a complex riddle that needed a solution. The servant was surprised, as he didn't immediately understand what his master meant in his thoughts. The gentleman drew attention to an ancient legend, which said that if the beautiful princess agreed to marry, she must ask 3 riddles, to which the groom must find the correct answers. Then the servant realized that it was just a fairy tale in which, after many failed attempts, a poor young man used his wits to solve the riddles and win the heart of the princess. The gentleman hoped that this riddle would be the only one he would have to solve in his life, because he did not want to find himself in a situation where he would have to find a solution to such a difficult problem. He thought that perhaps it would be better to return to the beginning, where Lady Marquise had once asked him for help in finding the heart of St. Olga, and this request was far from ordinary. At this point, the diamond was in the hands of a baron who owned a casino. This was a significant event, as Baron Itz wielded influence and was known in society as the owner of a major establishment. Fontinga had a huge main casino that dominated the others, as well as several smaller casinos, 3 or 4 in total, each attracting its own audience. He asked how Daniel could know so much about the casino and expressed doubt that he was involved in gambling, as the information seemed too detailed and well thought out. Daniel replied that he was categorically not involved in gambling, but his younger brother had a casino debt. He had repeatedly helped him pay off the debt so that his brother wouldn't find himself in an unpleasant situation. If Daniel was indeed the owner, the gentleman could assume that he had some understanding of the complexity and stress involved in running such a business, giving him a unique insight into the problem. Most likely, this was one of Uncle Rhaegar's inexhaustible sources of income, and the gentleman could not help but inquire what they were going to do with this knowledge and how they planned to act in the future. Then the gentleman wondered what to do, since the trustworthy man deceived by the casino owner had died. Knowing this, they would hardly be able to pretend nothing had happened. The gentleman decided that if we were talking about a casino, then now would be the best time to visit there, before the situation got out of control and more information could be gathered. The Duke quickly got ready, checked all the necessary preparations, and the whole group headed to their destination, determined to figure out what was happening. Upon entering the casino, they saw a large crowd gathered there. All the guests were wearing masks, creating an atmosphere of mystery and secrecy typical of such establishments. The establishment's profits were particularly high today, but suddenly, a servant rushed up to them, choosing a moment when no one was listening, and announced that something serious had happened. The Baron, hearing the news, was angry. He reminded them that he had repeatedly warned his men not to allow themselves to disturb the atmosphere of the hall, otherwise the guests would lose interest in the game. The servant nevertheless tried to explain that this was not a matter of trifles, but of a truly serious problem that could influence the entire course of events of the evening. The Baron didn't immediately understand what exactly was going on, but the servant finally explained. Archduke Ephron had arrived to see them, and his presence was changing all their plans. He found himself in possession of the actual title deed to St. Olga's heart. The Baron, upon seeing this, was completely confused and almost immediately became enraged with unexpected anger and fear. Meanwhile, the Archduke entered the room without any fuss, and the Baron hastened to pay his respects to him, pretending that he was not embarrassed by either the situation or his own excitement. The Baron wondered what had happened that was so important that His Highness had personally graced this old, poor gambling establishment, clearly unworthy of his attention, with his presence. The Archduke approached him, holding the papers in his hands, and without further ado showed them to the Baron, making a silent gesture to indicate that he should look and say whether he recognized the document. The Baron peered more closely at the papers presented to him, and, upon reading them, suddenly realized they were the rights to St. Olga's heart. He had difficulty remembering that he had purchased it 7 years ago. The Duke remarked in a cold tone that the ownership had passed to him, since the Baron had never paid the full price for the jewel during all these years, which meant that he could take the stone without any hindrance. The Baron tried to remain calm and said that he would first like to verify the diamond's authenticity and check the data against the records in his trading book. The Baron was utterly horrified, unable to believe his ears. His face fell and his hands trembled slightly with tension. He quickly declared that he categorically rejected such a demand, finding it completely unacceptable. But the Duke didn't even deign to answer the Baron. He commanded his servants to search every room and immediately find the required document, making it clear that he would tolerate no objections or delays in this matter. The Baron, overcoming his excitement, firmly noted that no matter what high position the Archduke occupied, he still did not have the right to so brazenly violate the order and laws in force in this institution. The Archduke, with an icy grin, said that if the Baron really had any claims, then he should prove them in action and bring the diamond right now, without further ado. The Baron hastened to assure her that he had a magnificent blue diamond, far larger and more beautiful than the one required, and if he could exchange one stone for the other, he was ready to settle the matter immediately. However, the gentleman replied with cold determination that this was merely a pathetic attempt to evade demands. He needed St. Olga's heart, and he had no intention of replacing it with anything else. After all, the lady for whose sake all this fuss was being arranged had previously wished to receive the heart of St. Olga as a gift, and the Duke had no right to disobey her will. At this tense moment, one of the servants approached the Archduke and, bowing his head, respectfully announced that he had discovered something extremely important that the master absolutely must see. A dank, fetid basement, hidden from view by outsiders, housed a gloomy dungeon. The stone walls were covered in green mold, a chill and dampness wafted in from all sides, and in the depths stood old iron cages, securely locked. As they slowly descended the creaking stairs, the gentleman experienced a genuine shock. His eyes widened in horror, his heart began to beat faster, and his insides turned cold at the abomination that lay before him. In the semi-darkness of the basement, he saw a multitude of children huddled in locked cages. Their thin figures trembled with fear and cold. At that moment, rage overwhelmed the master, and he immediately realized that a slave trade was taking place here. His servant, standing nearby, was completely perplexed. He couldn't understand how such things had even been tolerated in these parts. Everything that was happening seemed to him a monstrous violation of all laws and regulations. The Duke, too, couldn't explain how anyone could even think of such horrific things. It was beyond her comprehension that anyone could dare allow such atrocities within such noble walls. The thought that such small children could be treated so cruelly was truly horrifying. Their defenseless faces, filled with fear, left neither heart nor mind at peace, making one shudder internally. At this time, Artesia was having a long conversation with the Marquise. She carefully noted that she had learned that after his ordeal, the Crown Prince could gain new experience that could influence his future direction, and she believed that this was precisely how things would turn out. However, the Marchioness, seated in a luxurious armchair, didn't understand where Lady Rosanna was heading. Her slightly surprised look suggested she saw no logical connection in her young interlocutor's words. The lady calmly continued her reflections, noting that gambling, illegal substances, bribery, and other such practices were perfectly acceptable in high society. After all, true aristocracy had long since learned to turn a blind eye to such matters. However, harming children could have caused public outrage so strong that His Majesty would have been forced to feign anger in order to maintain control over public sentiment and avoid unrest. The Marchioness, not grasping the full depth of the hints, decided it was all connected to a personal threat. She felt that by talking about children, Artesia was trying to indirectly intimidate her or pressure her into accepting her position. But Artesia calmly and reservedly explained that her words had a completely different meaning. She wasn't threatening, but merely hinting subtly, wanting to warn and allow him to make the right decision in time. She emphasized that it would be in the Marquis's best interests to yield and take a step back for the sake of His Highness, Archduke Rhaegar. After all, not only her position but also her future at court depended on it. The Marchioness, confused by the stream of subtle hints, admitted she didn't understand where the lady was heading. In response, she cautiously inquired about Artesia's thoughts on the relationship between Archduke Rhaegar and Baron Itz. Baron Itz was known as a narrow-minded and greedy man, willing to bribe anyone he saw as offering even the slightest opportunity to benefit himself. His reputation had long been distrusted. However, such a decent person as the Marquise could hardly have even imagined that behind the Baron's outward politeness there lurked a far from clean nature and a readiness to do anything for his own benefit. She could not even imagine that the beautiful gemstone she had recently received from the Baron as a gift had actually been stolen by him from an honest and respected merchant. Marquise Camelia finally realized that the young lady before her possessed a rare intelligence and insight. This thought left her slightly sad that their meeting had occurred so late. She felt sorry that fate had not brought them together earlier, so she asked the lady for a short moment to personally say a few words to her new young companion, as if addressing her own daughter. The Marquise gave her a special cabinet containing a single, very important stone. This object was more than just a jewel. It carried a special meaning, passed down through generations. The necklace was designed specifically for St. Olga's heart. The Marchioness asked the young lady to accept it without alteration, respecting its original appearance and the history contained within its every feature. Many years ago, when she was not yet recognized as the daughter of a marquis and did not bear the title of lady, she had the chance to see from afar the most noble woman, Her Majesty the Empress, which left an unforgettable impression. It was then that she heard a touching story about a family heirloom that belonged to the Viscountess Pasher, the Empress's personal maid and close friend, whose gem was an object of admiration. When the Empress addressed her friend of humble origin with particular tenderness and respect, even praising her jewel, young Camelia felt such envy that this scene was forever imprinted in her memory. She was still tormented by the resentment that such a noble gem belonged to a greedy man, far from true aristocracy. This injustice left a heavy mark on her soul. The Marquise explained that the necklace was merely a temporary repository for the stone, as the statue of Saint Olga for which it was created had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind only legends. With a slight smile, the Marchioness Rosanna said she understood perfectly. Her words rang true enough that Madame Camelia could accept them without hesitation. The Marquise added that if she had truly been ready to bow before the Empress, she would have given up her jewelry long ago, without thinking about the price or consequences, thereby emphasizing the seriousness of her intentions. This precious stone became more than just a beautiful object for her. It was a trophy of sorts, a symbol of influence and power, which she treasured as a reminder of her victories. The Marchioness Camelia hoped that the lady would be able to properly convey all the subtle nuances of her feelings, so that no one would have any doubts about her true intentions and commitment. The Marchioness Camelia also noted that their engaging conversations could form the basis of a strong friendship. She openly invited Artesia to visit her more often to continue their interesting conversations. Artesia responded with a slight smile, but said nothing. Only when she was already seated in the carriage did she realize that everything was gradually beginning to change, and that events around her were taking an unexpected turn. Upon returning home, Artesia immediately wrote a letter to Hanson's family. In it, she outlined a plan to discuss and prepare the conditions for their prompt return and further actions. After several days of painstaking work, all the preparations were finally complete. Now all that remained was to carry out the plan and acquire the property belonging to the Marquise Rosanne. The next morning, the usual bustle of morning life reigned at Rosanne's estate. The maid, with exaggerated respect, bowed to Archduke Ephron, greeting him with due formality. She took her time, knowing her task was to lead her guest to a comfortable location. With a slight bow of her head, the maid announced that she would accompany him to Mrs. Artesia's boudoir. This was a significant moment, and her voice was gentle but with a hint of urgency, signaling the importance of the visit. The gentleman was completely stunned when he heard he would be taken to the boudoir. It was a place where people usually spent time in an intimate setting, and he couldn't understand what exactly awaited him in this house. The boudoir was a room where, traditionally, lovers were invited to flirt with each other, spending time together, leaving all formalities at the door. The fact that he was being directed there gave him pause. At that moment, his thoughts sharpened, and he suddenly realized that he himself had now become the very lover Mrs. Artesia had addressed. The thought flashed through his mind that he had become her fiancé, which gave the situation a special poignancy. This realization made him feel uneasy. Suddenly, embarrassment appeared on his cheeks and his face flushed. He didn't know what to do with these feelings that were tearing him apart inside. When they entered the boudoir, Emily was already assisting Mistress Artesia, carefully selecting her outfit. Under her attentive gaze, Artesia looked truly dazzling. Her skin was snow-white, like porcelain, and any color suited her perfectly. At that moment, the maid announced that Archduke Frone had arrived. Emily, hearing this, couldn't hide her joyful excitement. Seeing her master in person was a great event for her, one she had been looking forward to. For maids and servants, seeing their master before them was an important part of their lives. His appearance was always perceived as a sign of respect, and they could not ignore it. All the attendants bowed their heads in respect, and the gentleman himself, momentarily lost in thought, couldn't tear his gaze away from Artesia. She was truly magnificent, and his admiration was evident, though he tried to maintain restraint. Artesia was incredibly beautiful. However, feeling his gaze fixed on her, he suddenly lowered his eyes. His embarrassment grew, and he tried to conceal his feelings, trying not to reveal what was going on inside his soul. Emily smiled and said that was enough laughter, and the mistress corrected her slightly. The room had already fallen silent, and the mistress felt that the moment was not quite right for further conversation. The Archduke apologized for his early visit. His mistress added with a light remark that it was more than 2 hours since breakfast, and the time for morning meetings was long past. Her words were spoken calmly, but with a certain undertone. Emily calmly remarked that she'd already observed the outfit long enough to know where to go next. She added that she needed to take her leave, and then, without further ado, began to pack, preparing to leave the room. Having quickly completed her preparations, Emily left without further ado, followed by her assistants. She quietly closed the door, and her footsteps faded beyond the room, leaving everyone in complete silence. Only the Duke and the Marquises remained in the room, alone. The atmosphere grew somewhat tense, and both felt the heaviness in the air increase. They had to decide what to do next. The situation eased somewhat when the lady asked the gentleman to sit down and offered him tea. The atmosphere in the room softened slightly, but a slight awkwardness remained between them, as the conversation was only just beginning. After a while, they were sitting at the table with cups of tea, feeling a little more relaxed. The silence in the room was broken only by the sound of their breathing and the gentle clink of the cups they carefully held in their hands. The gentleman, as if thinking aloud, remarked that he felt a little more reassured. He admitted that the previous night had been difficult for him, and he hadn't been able to get enough rest, which was affecting his well-being. The lady, watching him, added that, in her opinion, his interaction with Amelia had been more tiring for him than a sleepless night. Her words were sympathetic, though with a slight emphasis on the gentleman's experiences. The Duke, sighing slightly, admitted that he was simply not used to such situations. Last night had been overwhelming, and he wanted to reassure himself of a few things before apologizing to her. The lady, despite all the circumstances, did not object and was ready to hear him out to the end. He said he had promised to bring St. Olga's heart, but ultimately, that had proven impossible. Lawrence smiled as he noted that he probably wouldn't be able to give it to her as a wedding gift, as he'd originally planned. It was all turning out to be much more complicated than he'd expected. The lady noted with slight regret that they were both in this situation and that she would likely be the one asking for forgiveness. She understood the complexity of the situation. In fact, while he was busy with his own affairs, she secretly met with the Marquise Camille. This was due to her desire to obtain the necklace, which could play an important role in the future. The lady, taking a deep breath, apologized for the deception. She admitted that she had known about the situation for a long time, that she had been playing the game from the very beginning, which was completely unexpected for the gentleman, who hadn't expected it from her. Yesterday, he was extremely agitated, faced with a difficult situation. He was lost in thought, wondering whether he should pretend he hadn't seen anything in order to ultimately retrieve the gem. The question remained unclear. He considered finally resolving all his problems, even if it meant losing the precious jewel that was so important to her. She, in turn, hoped he wouldn't get the stone. The lady asked him a question that implied something more. She wanted to know why she was attracted to him. It wasn't just curiosity, but a desire to understand his true nature. These words slightly confused the gentleman. Somewhat perplexed, he asked again what she was actually talking about, not fully understanding the meaning behind the question or what exactly she wanted to hear from him. She noted that, as a nobleman, he could have lived peacefully in his own world, protected from all worries and difficulties. But despite this, his heart always turned to where the people needed him. She pointed out that his actions and thoughts always focused on those whose well-being depended on his decisions. This was important because he always focused on the interests of the people. The Duke was surprised to realize she valued him so deeply. At that moment, it became clear to him exactly what she was talking about and why she valued him so, though he had never expected such frankness. Now that everything was clear to him, he felt a sense of relief. He realized that this moment had been a turning point for him, and he now understood why she valued his actions and intentions so much. He hadn't expected such words from her, but despite the unexpectedness, he was pleased to hear this confession. It gave him confidence that she valued him not only for his title, but also for his personal qualities. He noted that he had plans to meet with the Chancellor later, and that this meeting would be in person. This was an important step, and he wanted to ensure everything would go according to plan before making further decisions. She said she understood perfectly well the importance of being a fair and admirable person, and that the Duke had made a wise decision in doing so. She was confident it was the right move, worthy of respect. She also explained that His Highness, despite his military service, has no direct connection to politics, and that there is no need to change his established image at this time. There is still time to follow through with current plans. Artesia felt it was sometimes important to check in on how things were going, and that this was entirely reasonable. She believed that such steps could only help in making further decisions, even if they seemed insignificant at first glance. She noticed he wasn't interested in what she planned to do with St. Olga's heart. It was her decision, and she would decide what to do with this important symbol, but he didn't seem to be asking himself that question. When she explained that she planned to give St. Olga's heart to the Empress, he looked at her with respect, as if understanding the importance of her decision. This step was more than just a gesture for her, but something greater and more significant. She said it would be right for the thing that belonged to her precious friend to remain in her hands. Keeping this symbol with herself, in her opinion, would be the most respectful and correct act. The gentleman lowered his gaze and said he understood her completely. He acknowledged her wise decision and supported her, even if his own feelings at the moment remained somewhat complex and conflicted. Then the lady asked if he was upset, as her gaze suggested he wasn't feeling well. She noticed his concern, but wasn't sure she understood his state correctly. The gentleman reported that they were able to do this because information about Viscountess Pashker had surfaced. He suspected that it was all part of some plan and couldn't understand why he should be worried about it. He added that without a gift, it would be difficult to make a truly lavish proposal, and it would not be enough to impress and earn her consent to marriage. The lady, hearing these words, lowered her head and began to understand what exactly was being discussed. Her thoughts gradually led her to the understanding that her role in this process was also significant. He remarked that he would like to take her hand at his disposal and was ready to do everything possible to offer her something valuable that would become a symbol of their future union and an important step in their relationship. He took out a bracelet and carefully placed it on her wrist. At that moment, he said he would replace the traditional wedding gift with this piece of jewelry, which would serve as a reminder of this important moment. While he was in a jewelry store, looking for the perfect piece of jewelry for Olga's heart, he suddenly realized that this bracelet should also become a gift that would leave its mark on her life and on their relationship. Afterwards, he knelt before her, unable to hide his feelings and intentions. His gesture was a symbol of his readiness to devote himself entirely to her and their future together. He said the words he had wanted to say for so long and proudly asked her to marry him, hoping that this moment would be as important for her as it was for him. The lady was greatly surprised by this action. She hadn't expected him to make such a proposal right then, and her heart was filled with a feeling of confusion and, at the same time, joy at the unexpectedness. Meanwhile, across from the Department of Public Security, everyone was demanding the public execution of the criminals caught in full view of the people. Emotions were running high on the streets, but they were far removed from all of this. They say that when children were kidnapped, they were often released into hunting grounds, leaving only one option: killing them for sport. It was absolutely monstrous and unimaginably cruel, but it happened back then. A casino owner, rumored to be a baron, kidnapped children and sent them to Count Aeson. This wasn't his only such act, but it was this one that attracted the attention of the authorities and aroused serious suspicion. Amarant Summer Palace. The emperor exclaimed in irritation that he didn't even want to hear about communicating with a man like Count Aeson. Lawrence found himself in a bind in this context, as his connection with the count proved too complex. Lawrence tried to justify himself by claiming he and the Count had no personal relationship. All that connected him to Aeson was the bond between their fathers, and it was this bond that truly underpinned the relationship between their families. Lawrence's brother, with a hint of contempt in his voice, called him a puppy and added that he was incapable of independently assessing the full complexity of the situation. He perceived his behavior as naive and stupid, which only made everything worse. He declared that, of all the things that happen in this world, the slave trade is the worst evil, especially when it comes to the lives of innocent children who are being killed. Lawrence didn't know how to react to his brother's words, as they came as a shock to him. The issue of bribery was particularly pressing, as it was so ingrained that no one could circumvent it. Lawrence requested that this issue be thoroughly investigated, as this was an important step in combating the slave trade. The gravity of the situation was so great that even the stubborn Lawrence, who usually did not accept compromises, was willing to turn a blind eye to corruption in order to deal with this terrible incident, which only confirmed the seriousness of what was happening. Lawrence had just finished applying yellow polish to his nails when the Marchioness of Melera entered the room. Her beauty immediately caught his attention, even in such an unremarkable situation. Her steps were confident, and she looked as if nothing could faze her. She was incredibly beautiful and elegant, and her attire, a bright red dress, accentuated her grace. All eyes in the room instantly turned to her. A faint smile crossed her lips, and she approached the Emperor, seemingly oblivious to what was happening around her. The Marquise approached the Emperor and gently urged him to calm down, urging him to leave all his worries behind. She knew how important it was to remain calm in such a situation, and her words were as confident and gentle as ever. The Emperor noticed that she had hurried to him, concerned for the health of her son, whom he considered too vulnerable. He smiled slightly, but still couldn't hide his concern. He immediately realized that she had come here not only out of duty, but also out of maternal affection. The Marchioness explained that she had just spoken with a doctor who said that excessive worry could seriously affect her son's heart. She did everything possible to ease his worries and anxieties, knowing how important it was to maintain harmony in the family. The Emperor noticed that she, as always, tried to protect his son, but at the same time, this was hindering his maturity. He couldn't understand why, at her age, she still worried so much and didn't allow him to cope with difficulties on his own. This seemed strange and even somewhat absurd to him. He recalled that at his age, he was already ready to fight for his place in the sun and the right to be heir. The Marchioness, however, believed that it was precisely her care and attention that made him so vulnerable, preventing him from developing and becoming independent. Then the Emperor firmly declared that his son must immediately sever his relationship with Aeson, and he would try to resolve all remaining problems himself. This was his decision, and he hoped that the Marquise would finally understand that she must let her son go, give him the opportunity to become independent. He reflected on how lucky he was to have Cedric, a just and loyal man. But even his strength couldn't protect him from the weakness that emerged when it came to those closest to him. The Emperor realized that he must be wise and decisive in any situation, regardless of his feelings. Thinking about Artesia, he decided he wouldn't interfere in Lawrence's affairs. Problems with his half-brother shouldn't distract him from more important matters. Lawrence, though his biological brother, wasn't that important in his plans. Upon his return, he pondered how he could establish a closer relationship with Edric. It wasn't as easy as it seemed at first. He understood that trust needed to be built, but that process took time. The Emperor clearly understood that he had to find a way to mend his relationship with Edric. However, he knew he had to be careful. Being Edric's father didn't mean their bond was strong enough. He realized that, despite the family ties, he had no grounds for making Lawrence his heir. Such a responsibility could not be passed on simply by right of blood. He could not make a decision that did not have compelling reasons. The next day, at Roseanne's estate, the atmosphere was tense. Everything was set for a small tea party, but as usual, something was going wrong. Roseanne was about to meet several important people, and her attention was focused on the details. The maid approached Roseanne and said she was ready to do her hair. However, her mistress deemed it unnecessary for a simple tea party. Her habit of not paying attention to small details seemed characteristic of her relaxed approach to life. The maid insisted on her own way, emphasizing that her work must be done perfectly, no matter the circumstances. Her commitment to high standards prevented her from leaving anything for later. She believed in the importance of every detail. As the maid lifted Roseanne's sleeves, she noticed the bracelet the Duke had given her. It was a small but noticeable piece of jewelry, immediately catching her eye. The lady visibly blushed, realizing how easily the gesture could have been misinterpreted. The maid also noticed that Roseanne's sleeves had recently become fashionable. She couldn't help but notice that her mistress's style had changed. Fashion had apparently become an important part of her life, and her attention was now focused on details such as clothing and accessories. Roseanne met Hazel and Meal, whom she hadn't met before. It was her first encounter with them, and she was eager to make a good impression. She listened intently to their conversation, trying to discern their goals and motives. They noticed a bracelet on the table that had once been a gift from Archduke Ephron. This bracelet was undoubtedly magnificent. Its sparkling diamonds caught everyone's eye, causing everyone to admire its beauty. This diamond bracelet has recently become famous. Everyone who heard about it was fascinated and intrigued. It seemed there wasn't a single woman who didn't know about this piece of jewelry. Indeed, if you count all the articles and rumors surrounding this bracelet, they'd be countless. Ephron's bracelet became more than just a piece of jewelry, but a symbol of his love and generosity. At that moment, a maid burst into the room, followed by the mistress. She immediately inquired what had happened, as guests were already in the house, and such behavior was completely inappropriate. The maid, coming closer, whispered important news to her mistress. Her words were filled with alarm, as if something unexpected and extremely important had happened. Everyone's attention was riveted on her story. The maid quietly announced that Mistress Malera had returned. This news stunned everyone. Malera, who had not been seen in this house for a long time, had suddenly returned, causing great concern among those around her. Malera entered the hall, immediately asking what all this meant, and what kind of carriage was standing at the door. She was clearly nervous, as returning home always brings with it a host of questions and anticipation. The maids hastened to explain that the lady had arranged a tea party for her guests. This decision was unexpected, given the circumstances, and caused discontent among some of those present. This news deeply infuriated the woman. She couldn't understand how they could have arranged a tea party without taking care of more important matters. Her voice was filled with hurt and irritation. She exclaimed that it was crazy to behave like that. While she was gone, the house had been in complete disarray, and she couldn't come to terms with what was happening around her absence. Lawrence was preoccupied with important matters, and she tried to be polite, but this servant's foolish actions drove her to the brink of fury. She couldn't understand how anyone could be so unreasonable and irritate her. The ladies who came to the tea party were delighted with Mrs. Artesia's bracelet. They admired its beauty, couldn't take their eyes off its sparkling diamonds, and discussed how valuable and unusual it was. They couldn't stop examining the bracelet, praising it at every turn. Every detail seemed perfect to them, and the discussions never ceased, as such a gift would be the pride of any woman. It all ended when they heard the mistress return. The atmosphere in the room immediately changed, and the tension became palpable. The mistress's return always meant something important or dangerous for everyone present. She entered the room, her gaze filled with fury. Her entire being seemed to emanate a dark aura that made everyone around her feel uneasy and uncomfortable, as if the very atmosphere were becoming threatening. Artesia hadn't warned them that she'd be forced to leave them for a while. She hadn't explained the situation properly, and now this was becoming a source of misunderstandings that were quickly escalating. The lady approached her mother, and instantly all attention was focused on them. It was that moment when any word could be the last in the conversation, and much depended on it. She addressed her mother with restraint, welcoming her back. The simple greeting was an attempt to establish some kind of rapport, but its coldness was clearly noticeable and couldn't hide the tension between them. However, her mother immediately screamed at her, accusing her of stupidity. Her words were full of anger and disappointment, and she couldn't contain her emotional outburst, which was so powerful it was disorienting. At one point, the mother grabbed her daughter by the hair, and all the women present were utterly horrified by what was happening. No words could describe the cruelty with which it was done, and everyone froze. She began hitting her, declaring that she had already warned her that a normal life couldn't exist with a family member like Artesia. The mother's anger was uncontrollable, and her words, full of condemnation, tore the atmosphere apart. There was a strong sense of hostility in her words. She believed that Artesia's place was far from palace affairs, where she should be busy with household duties and doing things like embroidery. The ladies present in the room could not remain silent and began to intervene, trying to stop her. They begged their mistress, the Marchioness Rosanna, to cease her violence and calm down, but her fury was unstoppable. Mel, who was watching the scene, couldn't bear the strain and fainted. The fear and shock of what was happening before her eyes were so intense that she lost consciousness right then and there. The Marchioness declared that she would decide for herself what to do with her daughter, and that now was the perfect time to accept gifts, jewelry, and clothing from men. She considered this absurd, since all she had left was blood. The Marquise lunged at her daughter, knocking her to the ground. The maids tried to restrain her, but to no avail. The atmosphere in the room was tense, and the girl herself felt the full brunt of the blow. The mother, her voice furious, screamed at her daughter, reminding her that she had given her life, given birth to her, and made her a marquise. All of this should have made her grateful, but she believed her daughter clearly didn't appreciate it. And now, in her opinion, this very daughter was paying for her ingratitude. The woman, unable to contain her emotions, continued to scream, accusing her daughter of shamelessness and betrayal, and mercilessly beat her. The woman swung, throwing everything she could get her hands on at her daughter. Her daughter was already badly beaten and could barely stand. She tried to hold back her tears, but the pain was too intense to hide. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Archduke Ephron entered the room. His appearance was unexpected, and it somehow instantly changed the atmosphere, which had previously been filled with shouts and noise. Archduke Ephron approached the girl and asked with concern if she was all right. His gaze was full of concern, and despite the gravity of the situation, his presence suddenly brought at least some relief. Artesia, completely surprised to see the Archduke, was stunned. She couldn't understand why he was there, or at what point his presence had become so important. Emotions overwhelmed her. Upon seeing him, his mother began screaming and indignantly demanding an explanation as to who had allowed the Archduke to barge into someone else's house with such impudence. She soon drove him away, wanting nothing more to do with him. She kept telling him to leave, claiming her mother had told her to. But there was no conviction in her voice. It was clear she still didn't fully understand what was happening at the moment, or what she needed to do. The Duke was clearly irritated. He said he'd had enough and wouldn't tolerate such behavior any longer. His words were sharp, and the look he gave her clearly showed his irritation. The Marchioness responded by declaring that she alone should be responsible for her daughter's upbringing and saw no reason for interference. She didn't understand why anyone should restrict her right to do so. The Duke lost his composure and seemed on the verge of anger. He replied that what was happening now had nothing to do with upbringing, and that he would no longer tolerate such an attitude toward his case. Artesia's mother calmly and confidently declared that she knew exactly how to treat her daughter, and no one, least of all the Duke, had the right to tell her how to raise a child properly. She was certain she was right. At that moment, the Duke abruptly approached, grabbed her hand, and demanded that she step aside and not interfere. His actions were decisive, and he had no intention of wasting time on explanations. Artesia, noticing his increasingly aggressive actions, tried to stop him. She warned him that if her mother were injured, there would be serious consequences, and the Emperor would certainly be angry. The Duke, ignoring her words, simply picked up Artesia. He carefully wrapped her in a blanket without saying a word. His actions were cold and confident, but there was something unsettling about them. Artesia was in complete shock. She couldn't understand what was happening. Everything seemed strange and frightening. The Duke only quietly told her not to worry. The Marchioness began screaming in panic, demanding that the Duke release her daughter immediately. She was her daughter, and she would not allow anyone to interfere in her family affairs like this. However, the Duke didn't react to her cries. He remained unperturbed, continuing to act as he saw fit. The Marchioness, unable to contain herself, screamed that Artesia belonged to her and that no one had the right to take her. The Duke finally answered, his voice cold and decisive as he said that Artesia was no longer hers, and that he would no longer listen to her complaints. The Marchioness believed that the decision about her daughter's life or death was hers to make. She couldn't understand why anyone would interfere in this process, since it was her own personal matter, and she should have made the decision herself. By this time, the servants and His Highness had already approached her, asking if he needed help with anything. The question was asked with genuine attention, and it was clear they were ready to respond to any of her requests. The young Marquise was to move into a new house starting today. He ordered the entire star sensor to be monitored and ordered everything confiscated down to the last detail so she could put everything back in its place later. The girl was badly beaten, and her condition left much to be desired. She barely managed to call out to Alice, hoping for help, but she looked as if she could barely stand after the trauma and trauma. She reported that there were other guests in the house and that Lady Meal had become ill. This was an important observation, as Meal's condition could require immediate attention, and the girl could not ignore her. The Duke, hearing these words, said that the lady-in-waiting was already aware of the situation and would take care of it herself. He added that everything would be under control, and she, in turn, should take care of her health and recovery. He asked her not to worry and to take care of herself, remembering the importance of recuperating in such a difficult situation. Her condition was too grave to think about anything else. The girl looked so battered that she could barely see her surroundings. She couldn't see clearly, but she felt her strength draining away, and it was difficult to focus on what was happening. A short time later, when she was brought into the room, she was already lying in bed. The doctor examined her, checking the severity of her injuries. He carefully examined her to determine exactly how long it would take for her to recover. When the Duke entered the room, the girl was in the process of treating her wounds. She noticed his presence and, despite her condition, tried to react. His gaze was directed at her with curiosity and some concern. The Duke was surprised by her condition, as he didn't know whether she was awake or not. He hadn't expected to see her in such a state, and it unsettled him a little, though he tried to keep a calm face. The lady reassured him, saying everything was fine and he could pass. She noted that if he had come to her with reproaches about her appearance, it would have been completely inappropriate, but he had no such intentions. The gentleman confirmed that he hadn't intended any reproaches. He was worried about her, that's why he came. They needed to sort things out somehow. She thanked him, noting that yesterday had been a misunderstanding, which she now understood. She sincerely thanked him for his help. The gentleman, in turn, replied that he couldn't have acted differently as the situation required intervention, and he couldn't ignore her at such a moment. The girl was surprised to note that she hadn't even expected him to come in person. She'd been sure his participation would be more formal, but he showed genuine concern, and that surprised her more than she'd expected. He, in turn, was also surprised that he had to do everything himself. He hadn't imagined the situation would develop this way, and that he himself would have to intervene to help. He asked if this was really her plan. This was an important point to clarify, to understand what steps she intended to take, and whether her actions were part of a larger strategy. He found yesterday's incident rather odd. He constantly instructed Alphonse to stay by her side, understanding that the situation required special attention and observation to avoid a recurrence. He demonstrated his constant presence as proof of his willingness to protect her. This was not only a necessity, but also his own desire to ensure her safety and well-being during this tense period. He, she, and Alphonse all understood perfectly well what was happening. The three of them knew how things stood, but each perceived the situation differently. There were no secrets between them, and everything had long since become obvious. But, surprisingly, on the day she decided to invite guests, he wasn't there. He vanished, and no one could explain exactly why. It was an unexpected turn of events that left her perplexed. At this moment, the Marchioness Rosanna returned. Artesia, observing her mother's return, declared that this didn't mean she knew absolutely everything that was going on around her. She was trying to conceal her true motives. The gentleman, hearing her words, was not satisfied with her answer. He said it was too general a statement, and once again asked her to be honest. Did she really have planned and orchestrated everything in advance? The girl quietly lowered her head, realizing her words couldn't hide the truth. She admitted that yes, everything had been carefully thought out, and her plan truly had clear goals, which surprised even herself. However, it wasn't as others thought. She simply invited people on the day of her mother's return, so as not to arouse unnecessary suspicion. It was all planned simply but with a touch of cunning, to avoid unnecessary questions. Her main goal was to convince those around her that her connection to the Rosanne estate had truly been severed. Artesia wanted everyone to believe this, as this was the only way she could act with complete freedom and without fear of consequences. But without a compelling reason, she couldn't gain full ownership of Rosanne. This was crucial to her strategy, and she understood that one mistake could ruin her plans and return everything to normal. She took the keys and the ledger from the butler. But that was only part of her plan. Everything had to be prepared down to the last detail, so that not a single detail would raise doubts in those around her. The Duke couldn't contain his anger and began shouting, expressing his dissatisfaction with her actions. He claimed that what she had done was completely unnecessary, and that the whole situation had only worsened the situation, causing unnecessary tension. But despite his fury, she stood firm and confidently stated that everything had happened exactly as she had planned. At her words, he suddenly calmed down, realizing that further argument was pointless.